Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 404, which magically has actually been found. It's not disappeared in an error message, but it's also a Patreon Drydock. So, well, lots and lots of questions to answer, so let's just get stuck in, I believe. So first off, I have a kind of a collective question based on several different patrons messaging me and talking to me about various things, which is, what are my views on AI in the realms of YouTube and naval history, and have I had any problems with AI? So first of all, yes, I have had some fairly major problems with AI, most specifically in terms of AI bot channels ripping off my content, and depending on the AI in question, the level of sophistication goes from either just painfully obviously terrible to, I mean, still not particularly smart, but you can see at least a decent effort has been made. So I found some AI channels which have literally just ripped one of my videos clean. Video description, title, the intro, even the thumbnail. I think one of them grabbed a video of mine on HMS Eskimo, and literally the only thing that was changed in the entire thing was that the text bar, which is usually at the bottom of my video thumbnails, had a red background instead of a semi-transparent background. Other than that, it was just a straight-up clone. In other cases, you've had AI channels which have ripped off my content, but taken the transcript of the video and redone it in whatever AI voice package they're using, which has been a little annoying because they're slightly harder to track down. And the thing is, YouTube's content detection bot, I don't know if it is in cahoots with its fellow AIs or something like that, but these are very obvious straight up cases of copy pasting, and it doesn't notice them. I've only known about it, I think, once because I got recommended it, and I thought that looks like a suspiciously familiar title, and several other times because you guys out there have seen one recommended to you and gone, hang on, this sounds like a video I watched recently, and then they've let me know, and of course I've dealt with those videos. So yeah, if you do happen to see AI channels, or to be honest, even regular channels, straight up ripping off my work, then please let me know, and I will very happily send the fires of vengeance down upon them. Because you can guarantee, if there's a channel that's uploading, a dozen plus videos a day, which a lot of these stupid AI bot channels tend to do, if there are 3, 4, 5, 6 of my videos scattered in the several hundred videos that it's just uploaded, you can guarantee there's probably a bunch of other people's videos in there that have also been ripped off. So they're trying to earn money off of other people's effort, multiple other people's efforts. But more generally, what's my opinion on AI? I am definitely not in favour of it, as you might guess by the big logo up there. Now, I'm not entirely against AI. I'm not one of these people who's like, oh no, the whole thing should be destroyed on principle. I mean, there's arguments you can have about AI and its impact on the world and people's critical thinking ability and all of this, but those are more personal opinions, not really relevant to specifically how it affects history and YouTube. AI bot channels are scum and should be destroyed, personally, because then they're not doing any real hard work. There is no driving force behind it. There's literally just someone telling an AI bot to create a bunch of inaccurate information and stick it up there and try and profit off of that. And that's the main problem I have when it comes to using AI in naval history specifically. If you're using it for your research, you're doing it wrong, because the AI gets things wrong all the time. And it can get stuff very blatantly wrong, obviously wrong. It can get stuff very subtly wrong. But either way, the minute anyone who knows what they're talking about looks at the channel, they're going to, no, this is off. And you can also tell, even when you've got the occasional human person reading an AI script, because you're like, no, that is just so wrong. If you knew all the stuff you said before and you actually knew all the stuff you said after, you wouldn't have said that bit in the middle, because it's so dramatically wrong, but it's clearly someone who has no idea what they're talking about, just reading off an AI script. So AI for straight up research and script writing, definitely not. AI for generating images. Now, here I'm a little bit more on the fence. I do not think you should be using AI to, generally speaking, generate any kind of imagery if you're at least in a historical context, for obviously specifically naval history, because it's never going to get it right. It might look halfway convincing, but one, if you're trying to pass off AI artwork as something real, that's deceptive in the first place, and two, as I said, it's never actually going to get the details right. Now, on the other hand, if you're using it for comedic effect, and sparingly at that, then yeah, fine. I can understand that element of it. And I know there is this whole issue of, obviously, AI is trained on other people's work, and there is arguments about AI potentially stealing from, or stealing commissions from other people. You know, would you have commissioned that artwork, but now you've done it with AI? That's a whole ethical issue. That there is the counterpart to that, which is that would you ever actually have commissioned something for a 5-second meme? Probably not, most of the time. But leaving that aside, personally, I think if you're just using it to generate funny pictures or and stuff like that, well, in and of itself, I don't see a problem with that. And I think at that point, you know, people are going to recognize that if you have an image of an actual seal or a sea lion dressed in US Navy combat gear, and you're like, hey, it's a Navy SEAL, obviously this is not a real image. So whatever. Now, where I do think AI has some benefit when it comes to naval history is, I think, in two areas. One is essentially using it as a glorified version of Google, because Google searches, for the most part, are or internet searches as a whole, are limited to your language and your ability to type something relatively succinct. You know, if you type a paragraph request into the Google search bar, it usually doesn't help you all that much. Whereas if you're using a decent AI model and you're stuck for sources and you say, okay, I'm looking for information on this really obscure, I don't know, Italian ship design. Can you tell me if there are any good books in Italian that cover this design? And of course, because the AI understands lots of different languages, unlike the English version of Google, obviously English in my case, it can then go off and go, oh, well, in Italian, I have found these books which mention to varying degrees the thing that you're looking for. And then you can take those titles, independently search them yourself, and determine, one, does the title actually exist? You know, hopefully it didn't hallucinate the title. And then two, try and work out, is this from, you know, reviews and so forth. You can try and work out, is this actually a good book? And if so, then perhaps you can find it. And that's something that you wouldn't necessarily have known about before, because you don't speak the language, whether it be Italian, German, Russian, Korean, etc., etc. So there is, I think, a use there as a way of finding real-world references for you to then use, but not obviously using it as a reference in and of itself. And the other thing, particularly when it comes to something like YouTube, where I think it could be useful, is in the realm of picture editing. Now, I don't mean picture editing as in inserting another image onto a historical image, again, to pass it off as real, because, again, that is misleading, you're being deceptive. But in terms of essentially basic photo editing, things like clearing up a photo that perhaps has a bunch of wrinkle lines on it, or color grading a photo that's perhaps a scan that's horribly washed out or something like that. Or if you yourself have taken a photo and there's something distracting in the background and you want to get rid of it. Because at that point, what you're essentially doing is just doing Photoshop work, essentially, except that you don't have the skills to do Photoshop and it's doing it faster for you. At that point, there's nothing about, you know, taking work away from other people or taking other people's work and using it. You're literally just speed running basic Photoshop editing or whatever else it is you want to be doing. However, I would put a really big caveat over that, which is even then, you have to be extremely careful that the AI doesn't edit the photo beyond what you've asked it to do, because we can and will do that. You can say, okay, for example, here is a photo I've taken of a model ship, maybe a builder's model in a museum, but the lighting was really terrible, and so could you just make the background a nice even color, an even blue, an even white, or anything, just so I can see the model a bit clearer, and improve the lighting. Now, that would be something that someone could do in Photoshop. You could teach yourself the skills to do in Photoshop, but, well, if you can do it in 10 seconds with an AI, then why not? However, you'll very often find that the AI will, while it will do what you asked it to, it will also do things like delete a gun barrel, or shorten the ship, or completely remodel the bow, or something like that. And even if you're very explicit and say, do not alter anything in the image other than what I've told you to do, it's still a kind of 50-50, so you still do have to be very careful. But as long as you're very carefully monitoring both input and output, there is a certain use, I think, in that, because it just allows you a bit more time and energy to just neaten up photos and images here and there, and then go on to actually do more important stuff. So there's my personal view on the matter. As I said, basically don't trust it, and don't use it for research, don't use it to create a channel, but it does have some uses, which I would say are a bit peripheral. But let me know in the comments below what you think. Captain Oblivious asks, the main goal of the US island hopping campaign in the Pacific is often portrayed as a campaign to suppress Japanese airfields and then use them for US air operations, all the while getting closer and closer to Japan. What was the most important Pacific island port, harbour or anchorage the US secured in World War II, not because it denied Japanese use, but because the US Navy could use it? Although an answer could always be the next one closest to Japan, I'm asking about the one that was recognised early on as a must-have potential game-changer, not knowing how the future would unfold. It very much depends on what portion of the war you're looking at. I think if you're looking for this would be really useful for the US Navy, and we're going for it specifically for those reasons rather than to stop the Japanese using it, then the ultimate answer is going to be Ulithi as depicted here, because the Japanese, although they held Ulithi as part of the Carolines, didn't really do much with it. Their main base in the Carolines was Truk. And so when the US occupied Ulithi and the surrounding islands, it was basically a near enough unopposed landing. And then, of course, it became the major fleet base for the closing years of the Second World War in the Pacific. So, that's a pretty easy one to point at. However, if you're talking about earlier in the war, then I would probably say the Gilbert Islands. The Solomon Islands were an important campaign, especially with obviously Guadalcanal, but it falls a lot more into the denying the Japanese use of them rather than, oh, we really specifically need this particular base. Whereas if you look at a map of both the US campaign generally in the Pacific as well as just the Pacific Islands, while there are a lot of Pacific Islands, they are mostly in a series of chains. And even once the US has secured most of the Solomon Islands, even if they're bypassing Rabaul, that and the Bismarck Islands, New Guinea, etc., they're essentially just near Australia. That they give you a degree of security against attack, but they don't really help you get close to Japan. And in the northern part of the Pacific, while you have Midway, which is kind of at one end of a very sparse chain that heads all the way back to Hawaii, there's not really anything between Midway and Japan. There's a bit of a distance. There's Wake off to the southwest, but there's not a huge amount to write home about. Whereas in the central South Pacific, you have the Gilbert Islands, which is Makin, Tarawa, etc. And if you can grab those, then not only can you have a naval base that is considerably closer to operations against Japan than Hawaii, and also still considerably closer than Australia and the other islands that the Allies can continuously hold, but it's also at the foot of a much longer chain of islands, because from the Gilbert Islands. It's a relatively speaking short trip to the Marshall Islands. From the Marshall Islands, it's a relatively short trip to the Carolines. And from either the Marshalls or the Carolines, you can go for the Marianas. And once you've got to the Marianas, you are now within B-29 range of Japan. And obviously, again, from the Marianas, you can go for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And theoretically, from there, you can go on to Japan. So the Gilberts are kind of like your foot in the door for a series of, again, relatively speaking, because the Pacific is large, small hops where you can claw your way into the Japanese defences. So from an absolute perspective, probably Ulithi, but from an early war perspective, as in we need this to enable everything else, probably the Makin Island campaign and the associated Gilbert Islands seizures. Michael Gilson asks, would it be practical to build a torpedo launcher inspired by a disappearing gun mount that turns to face fore and aft and then retracts into the deck when not in use? Trading a torpedo or two for the lower metacentric height and potentially ease of reloading? Would it be practical as in, could you do it? Yeah, probably. Would it be practical as in, would it be worth doing? I don't think so, because yes, you would be reducing the effect of the torpedo launcher on stability strictly from the perspective of, well, if it's normally stored lower down, the torpedo launcher and the torpedoes in and of themselves are going to have a somewhat lesser effect on stability. And of course, if it's down and then presumably enclosed, maybe with some kind of shutters that come across the top, then you have a nice enclosed environment to reload. But you can have reloading mechanisms, a bit like the old muzzle-loading rifle guns built into the bulkheads or something like that. However, the larger restrictions or issues would be, well, as you can tell with this disappearing gun mount, there's a huge amount of additional material and mechanisms that have to be introduced to enable a disappearing mount, and it does take up a bit more space than the average mounting in terms of just surface area. So you're going to be adding a lot more weight overall, and the effect of a lot more weight, even if it's one deck further down, might actually be a considerably greater impact than somewhat lesser weight further up. There's maybe a lot of calculations to work out, but it wouldn't surprise me if the additional weight of the disappearing mount mechanisms actually either offset or overrode any benefits of slightly lowering the height of the launcher. You've also got reliability issues, because with a normal torpedo mount, well, it has to spin. That's all it really has to do in terms of movement. With this disappearing mount, obviously there's a lot more that could go wrong or a lot more that could get damaged. And the last thing you want to do is, hey, we need our torpedo launcher. Well, sorry, a minor shell fragment severed a hydraulic line. Now it's stuck in the down position in the middle of battle. And you've also got to think about the space it takes up, because it's going to take up at least the volume one deck below what a standard torpedo launcher would otherwise take up. So if you're occupying internal hull volume, where before that hull volume was clear, what were you using that hull volume for? What are you having to put somewhere else? What are you having to not do in order to have this thing? And that's especially so on destroyers, which are probably the ones which, at least on paper, would be most likely to benefit from such a provision, but also have the least amount of internal volume to actually be able to make use of a disappearing torpedo launcher mount. But in theory, there may be one or two use cases where it might be handy. For example, in a lot of early interwar US destroyer designs where they have multiple banks of heavy torpedo launchers on either side of the ship, both to give them a lot of torpedoes generally, but also to give them multiple attack run capability. So you run in, you launch your starboard torpedoes, you go away, you come back, you launch your port side torpedoes, that kind of stuff. If you're replacing two or more sets of torpedo launchers with a single centerline mounted disappearing mount, or maybe even semi-disappearing mount, with the explicit purpose of storing a bunch of additional reloads slightly beneath the deck, so that the purpose of the mount is less so to conceal the torpedo launcher and more so to facilitate easier reloading, so you're not having to store all these additional torpedoes higher up. And then you're still getting essentially the same attack profile of 4 or 8 torpedoes, but you have your, let's say, 2 quadruple disappearing mounts. They pop up, You launch your torpedoes, and now you can launch them from either port or starboard, depending on what the tactical situation says. And then as you pull away, you drop them down, and they can then reload. Either one set of reloads, potentially even two, and then they pop back up again, and hey, now you can do another attack, which is essentially the same profile as you had before, only now you've enabled both attacks to be done from the same side, if that is what is necessary. And potentially in that case, you may actually be saving some weight, because you've cut your torpedo launchers down from, say, 4 quadruple launchers, 2 on each side, to just 2 on the centre line. William asks, I've seen a number of references to Wilson's proposed US Navy 1919 programme, but no details. Was it just a repeat of the 1916 programme, or were the ship numbers and designs different? It's all a little bit up in the air, unfortunately, because you have the 1916 programme, which is what eventually gives you the South Dakotas and the 1920 version and the Lexingtons. However, that programme is considerably delayed, so a good portion of the ships that are called for in the 1916 programme actually only end up getting laid down around about 1919 or so, and this thus technically are the 1919 programme. But if you want to look at what was the proposed successor plan to the ships that were authorised in the 1916 programme, we do have some idea. So there were multiple revisions of what was wanted, and even once the plan was approved, there was a couple of revisions thereafter. But if you want a snapshot in kind of late 1919 of what the plan at that point was to succeed the existing building plan, one of those snapshots would have the construction of 5 additional battleships on top of the 10 authorised in the 1916 Naval Act, plus 2 battle cruisers, plus aircraft carriers and cruisers. They didn't really need destroyers because the Wicks and Clemson class build program had taken on a kind of a life of its own. So you would have had an Omaha successor, a Lexington successor, a South Dakota successor, and some kind of carrier. Now, of course, if you want to know what some of those carriers designs might have looked like, then obviously check out the video I did recently on how US carrier design evolved in the interwar period. So some of those earlier designs were actually very similar to the historical Lexington and Saratoga, because essentially the purpose-built designs that they were coming up with grew to a size where they were displacing about as much as a Lexington. And someone said, well, if they're going to be about the same size and displacement of a Lexington, why don't we just save some money and use a Lexington-class hull, or at least the lines of one, as a basis, obviously with some modifications for carrier operations. And, well, that's roughly probably what would have been built. We know that the battle cruiser design had essentially taken riffs off of Hood, and again, that sort of covered in my US Navy battlecruiser design video. And essentially what they concluded was, well, Hood had the same armour and the same firepower as contemporary battleships in the Royal Navy. It was just faster. And they essentially got, okay, well, for the successors to the Lexingtons, we want a battlecruiser that is, again, either very similar to, though prepared to accept up to a 10% reduction, but otherwise, broadly speaking, similar in firepower and protection to the current battleship design, which at that point was the South Dakotas, just faster. So 12, 16-inch guns, and then either 13 and a bit inch armour, or inclined armour, which would have been then obviously somewhat thinner. With the battleships, again, there's a fair bit of variation, because there were essentially 2 lines of thought, one of which was, how can we take the South Dakota hull and expand it? And they were looking at, well, essentially South Dakota, but faster. They also looked at South Dakota, but more heavily protected, because they acknowledged that maybe the standard type of belt armor wasn't going to hold up against a dozen 16-inch guns or 9 18-inch guns. But you wanted to keep up the speed so that obviously the fleet could maintain its overall speed and maneuverability. There were also options which did a straight-up swap of the 4 triple 16s with 4 twin 18s, and there was even a really, really big version which said essentially, well, what happens if we do a 4 triple 18-inch version of the South Dakota? How big do we have to get that, and how much armour do we have to put on that? And it still has to maintain either 21 or 23 knots. And all of those went into various battleship designs, which would have then been laid down after the South Dakotas, but everything was still a little bit up in the air. There were some designs that had been formalized, but they were still obviously using the opportunity to revise battleship designs because they hadn't got authorization to lay any of them down yet before the Washington Treaty obviously collapsed everything anyway. Nathan Redder asks, in Drydock 391, you mentioned that if the Royal Navy had decisively won at Jutland, they could have leveraged that prestige to get more funding. If the Royal Navy had earned that prestige, what would the interwar fleet look like? You already mentioned 16.5-inch armed variants of the Queen Elizabeths instead of the Nelson class, but what else could they have gotten, and what would the other branches look like if the Navy had gotten more funding? Well, part of the reason I think they would have got more funding and potentially more ships would have been because if they are winning a decisive battle at Jutland, that means it's a much longer, more prolonged slugging match with the Germans, and even if they wipe the field with the High Seas Fleet, there's still inevitably going to be some casualties, either in terms of ships sunk and or in terms of ships too badly damaged to be, economically repaired. And so replacements are going to have to be built, and those replacements at that point might as well be entire classes, especially if you're looking at a situation where perhaps some of the older, slightly more vulnerable ships have taken considerably more damage and or losses, and people looking at it going, okay, well, we've got to replace, for various reasons, let's say half a dozen or so ships, but even if we do that, we're left with this little grab bag of older ship classes where there's only one or two left in service after all is said and done. So we might as well, phase those out over the next couple of years, and that'll allow us to bring our new construction up to 8 or 12 new ships, which then can operate in A, homogeneous groups, and B, obviously be considerably more powerful. So at a bare minimum, you probably see the remaining 3 Admiral class being completed to their revised design. I think there would have been a rather interesting segue after a 16.5-inch armed version of the Queen Elizabeths, so 24, 25-ish knots, possibly down to 23, depending on who exactly has final say, but much more heavily armed and somewhat more heavily protected. The next segue, I think, would have been, do they want to go with the next class? Because, with 8 or 12 ships, we are talking about either 3 4-ship classes or 2 6-ship classes, or some split variant thereof. Do you go with slightly more guns on a slightly more compact hull, or slightly more compact layout, I should say, allowing you to get more armour, i.e. adopt the triple turret and maybe have the successor class having 9 guns in 3 triple turrets instead of 4 twins? Or do you just keep going, well, the twin turrets worked for us so far, so just this but bigger, because now it has 18-inch guns? That may be something that would be maybe being laid down in 1918, 1919. Whether or not that would be completed, I think it would depend which gets laid down. Because I think if everyone else is building Nagatos and Colorados and so forth, and you go to the Washington Naval Treaty and Britain's got, let's say, 4 18-inch ships being laid down, that's going to be a rather big ask for everyone else to accept. Whereas if Britain's got another bunch of 16.5-inch ships under construction, it's going to be a little easier to go, okay, fine, upper gun limit is 16.5, not 16 inches, whatever. But I think possibly one of the most interesting developments that would come out of all of this is actually not necessarily to do with ships specifically, although they're a kind of ship in a way, and that would be in terms of the Air Force. Now, of course, historically speaking, the Royal Air Force is founded in 1918 by merging the Royal Flying Corps, which is essentially the Army's air service, and the Royal Naval Air Service, which, shockingly enough, is the Royal Navy's air service, and forming an independent third branch. Now, in a situation where the Royal Navy has proven above and beyond that it is the ultimate guarantor of Britain's security, I think there's probably a lot more political will that they could exert to say, no, you might want an independent air service, and Okay, that's fine. If you want to turn the Royal Flying Corps into its own thing, separate from direct army control, you can do that. However, we're still keeping our air service. And yeah, maybe as the Royal Navy Air Service, I don't know if they ever would be renamed the Fleet Air Arm at that point, but let's say they decide to keep the Royal Navy Air Service as is. Yeah, maybe they'll be forced to give up some elements of things, so perhaps coastal patrols, because they're operating out of land bases permanently, will become part of the Royal Flying Corps' remit, but stuff that is operating entirely at sea, so scout aircraft on ships and carrier aircraft, etc., that will still remain firmly under the control of the Royal Navy. And that would mean then going into the interwar period, depending on whether the Royal Flying Corps remains either as part of the British Army or perhaps becomes the Royal Air Force anyway, just without responsibility for naval bits and pieces, I think you would end up in a situation that, well, I wouldn't say necessarily reflects the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, because I don't think the Royal Navy and the Army would go at each other quite that enthusiastically, but perhaps more reflective of the situation in the US, where you have the US Army Air Force, which is still technically under Army command, but is increasingly becoming its own thing, at least, in operation, if not necessarily officially. But the US Navy, of course, still has its own completely separate air arm. And if the Royal Navy likewise retains that, then that means that A, it's going to get better and more dedicated aircraft designs, and B, it might also therefore have a little bit more interest in expanding its carrier programs, both in the section between World War I and the Washington Naval Treaty, and then post-Washington Naval Treaty, simply because they also have far more control of what those carriers are going to be flying. Felipe asks, "Hello, Drac. Regarding the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, after the attack, what ships did the US send to reinforce the base, and how quickly did they arrive? My real question is, would it have made sense for the Japanese to have stuck around after the attack, knowing that Pearl Harbor was going to get reinforcements, and then inflicting additional damage on them, especially since they knew that they hadn't sunk any of the carriers? Did they not have the munitions or the fuel? Was it deemed too risky, or was there some other reason?" So it depends how far you really want to go in the future after December 7th, because Saratoga's down in San Diego at the time, and essentially immediately turns around and sails out. Of course, Lexington and Enterprise are out and about in the vicinity anyway. Yorktown is shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific fairly quickly, but in terms of major assets that are directed to Pearl Harbor, that's pretty much it. And there's for a few good reasons. Firstly, the US Navy is very worried about, well, what you suggested, a follow-up attack. And given what's just happened to most of the battle line, well, putting a bunch more in that same position when your airfield's been shot up and all you'd have left to defend yourselves with is essentially a handful of surviving aircraft and some anti-aircraft guns, it's not really a good time to start putting more targets in place. But on top of that, there's also an awful lot of panic going on in the US, and some of that has to be assuaged, even though the US Navy itself understands that it's not actually going to do much. So, for example, a bunch of the older battleships that are still around that were in the continental United States or nearby at the time, they get reassigned to patrol up and down the US West Coast. Are the Japanese coming for the West Coast? No. Would having a handful of old battleships wandering up and down the West Coast help if the Japanese somehow did show up? No. Does it make the population of the US West Coast feel a lot better to see a big ship bristling with lots of guns wandering past every few days? Yes. And so that's essentially what happens. Plus, of course, Pearl Harbor's just been attacked. Pretty much all of its maintenance facilities are occupied in salvaging and repairing what can be salvaged and repaired. Battleship Row is out of commission. They've still got stuck battleships, like the Maryland, that haven't been particularly damaged but are trapped by other vessels' wrecks. The last thing they need at that point is to crowd a bunch more stuff in place and just make the whole overcrowding issue worse. So outside of Yorktown, and obviously more proximately Saratoga, in terms of major assets as opposed to auxiliaries and destroyers and so forth, not really a huge amount is actually sent to Pearl Harbor in the immediate aftermath of December 7th. at least until several months have passed. And in terms of the Imperial Japanese Navy, they did have enough munitions and aviation fuel aboard their carriers to theoretically carry out further strikes if they'd wanted to. But there were three main governing factors. Firstly was that losses to each of the attacks that they did send in had increased as time had gone on, shockingly enough, because the defences had been somewhat alerted. And they were worried, well, if we throw in another wave or two of attackers, then we're potentially going to take even more losses to our precious pilot corps. But the two much larger, more proximate issues were that, one, they had kind of announced themselves, they were around, and obviously, like you said, they knew they hadn't sunk any carriers, so where were the US carriers? Where was some of the US fleet? Is it possible that there could be a US force heading to attack them, as indeed Enterprise tried to do? So, with the element of surprise gone, they were somewhat exposed because they didn't know if or when a counterattack was going to be coming. And also, they had a rather critical fuel situation. The carriers themselves could potentially have stuck around for another day or so and launched a follow-up attack on, say, December the 8th. But a lot of their escorts were in a position of, we kind of need to go home at this point to be safe in terms of actually getting home with the fuel that we've got and the refueling infrastructure that's present with the combined fleet. There was also something of a schedule to keep because although Pearl Harbor was one of the opening stages of the Pacific campaign, it wasn't the only part of the Pacific campaign, and an awful lot of the ships in the Japanese fleet had been earmarked for further relatively proximate operations. So they'd done the best that they thought they could do on December 7th, and now they were needed elsewhere. Greg M. asks, new research suggests that King Harold went by boat to meet William the Conqueror. What do you think about that? What sort of navy would Harold have had, and how would that journey have gone? So we know the kind of navy that Harold would have had. Obviously, this is the Norman navy, because I'm using a bit of the Bayer Tapestry. But we know that Alfred the Great started off the Anglo-Saxon navy, so Harold's ships would have broadly been of a similar theme. So you'd be talking about larger, higher, and somewhat more seaworthy vessels than your average quote-unquote longship. Very suited for coastal defence and transport, and somewhat better in a sea fight, simply because more men, higher fighting platform, and that's really what dictates the course of naval battles in Northern Europe around about this time. And the navy that the English had at the time was apparently quite strong. We're talking about several hundred vessels. Now, in terms of the theory, which for those of you who haven't heard about it, is essentially that due to some misinterpretations of the various sources that are available, particularly a statement about the English fleet being coming home, i.e. heading back to London, the argument is that basically the Victorian historians that have formed the basis of the main historical narrative about 1066 that we think we have now misinterpreted the idea of the English fleet guarding the south coast against William, and then when Harold Hardrada shows up, the fleet is sent back to London and disbands, and then it's essentially just a series of land campaigns. The revised theory argues that actually if you look into the various sources, there are mentions of what appear to be the usage of ships at Stamford Bridge, and that potentially there's also maybe even a naval engagement that happens shortly after the Battle of Hastings, and that Harold probably used his fleet to transport his army from Stamford Bridge, or at least a good part of it, down from Stamford Bridge to at least London, if not further. And although I haven't obviously read the full body of work that's associated with this research, what it seems to suggest, at least again, based on my reading of it, is that Harold is now suggested to have essentially split his forces and tried to do a land and sea pincer movement, which, to be fair, does kind of fit with the way that he operated. If you look at what Harold was doing back when Edward the Confessor was king, this is very much in his ballpark. But the idea is that he would then march his army from London to Hastings, which is comparatively speaking a much shorter and easier journey, but that A portion of his elite housecarls would be on the ships, but the ships would be, the majority of the fighting men on the ships would be archers, because obviously it's a really good fighting platform to have archers. And that his plan was to try and corner William before William could get much into England, and essentially confront him in a land engagement while the English fleet destroys the Norman fleet, and presumably then lands its troops and attacks William from behind, thus crushing them between a small core of elite heavy infantry with significant archer support attacking from behind against a very solid shield wall of Anglo-Saxon infantry up on Senlac Hill, and thus William's evasion is defeated and destroyed in detail. Now, that actually sounds to me like a fairly decent military plan, and it would explain why, having put his army on a hill behind a shield wall, Harold seems to have had virtually no archers of his own, which seems, historically speaking, a little bit weird, because, well, that would be the perfect position to put your archers in. Put them behind the shield wall, maybe put the shield wall not on the crest of the hill, but a couple of feet further down, and then when the Norman charges come up, you just pepper them with arrows and, rake in the victory. But despite the fact that archers travel fairly easily, Harold never seems to have had any, or many at least. But if the majority of his archers are off with the fleet, along with some of his elite heavy infantry, suddenly their absence makes a certain amount of sense, if not necessarily speaking of absolute tactical brilliance. But I would have kept at least a few with my main army, but there you go. I'll be very interested, though, to read the bulk of the rest of the research, because obviously the article that Greg M. linked to me is a very short, précis, kind of almost a press release of what the professor in question is claiming. So I'll have to keep an eye out for the full paper and dig a bit deeper into what he's arguing for and what the evidence is. So on the face of it, given how Harold operated before, it certainly is plausible that that is what he would try and do. And essentially the argument is that the fleet, for whatever reason, was delayed, and thus only half the pincer ended up facing off against William, and thus you get the historical Battle of Hastings. But obviously, we have to check all the work. His Hibernian Majesty Rigel the 16th, Dominator 600 billion subjects, progenitor of many and nobody's puppet, asks, in your opinion, how many discrete naval national doctrines were there at the time of the Jeune Ecole? And can you talk a little bit about what made each of them different? I'm not sure if this will fully encapsulate all of them, but I can immediately think of 5 major naval doctrines in play around about the time that the Jeune Ecole also comes in. So first off, you have the British idea of naval doctrine, global control. So you have multiple large battle fleets positioned either at or near key strategic choke points across the world, a vast fleet of smaller ships, which are about to become cruisers, broadly speaking, which are doing commerce protection and showing the flag exercises, and the vast majority of your power comes from both demonstrating naval dominance and essentially being able to turn up at any point in the world and go, this patch of the sea belongs to us, and technically speaking, it always has done, it's just we hadn't enforced it at this point. And you are conducting a lot of your overseas military operations, mostly by ferrying troops to and from with your ships. So in the words of Jackie Fisher, the army is a projectile to be fired by the Navy. So this is a naval doctrine that essentially is based around the fact you already have control, and now you have to maintain it, partly by putting in the legwork day to day with anti-piracy patrols and all this kind of thing, and partly by just being there as an imminent threat with a very large fleet. Then you have a doctrine of what I would term local control. So these are navies that acknowledge straight up that there are the big powers in the world, and yes, their navy is never going to be able to challenge them, but also they don't really care, because they're not really bothered with the fact that the British Navy exists, because they don't plan on ever fighting the British Navy. But what they do plan on fighting is the navy of the very annoying upstart country, or potentially very annoying long-term rival country right next door. So they will build up a fleet that in some ways will resemble the British fleet in miniature. So it will have a battle fleet, it will have cruisers. Towards the end of the Jeune Ecole period, it will also have torpedo boats and so forth. But essentially, it's a mini battle fleet designed to do battle fleet things, i.e. go out and dominate the seas, but in a relatively local and usually relatively short-ranged area. So you could look at, for example, the Italian and Austro-Hungarian fleets at the Battle of Lissa, although that fractionally predates the true rise of the Jeune Ecole. But those are good examples of the fleets, and the way they built up afterwards to maintain the standoff is also a good example of that kind of thing. Then you would have coastal defence forces. So the difference between this and local control would be that local control is still looking at a oceanic deep water navy of some description or other, but a coastal defence fleet is almost entirely defensive. The local control fleets are aimed as much at offence as defence, and they will tend to have more specialist ships. So essentially this is a country going, we have no particular ambitions on a global stage, but we also don't want all these other smaller powers who might have local control fleets and so forth coming in and muscling in on our little strip. The German Navy and the Swedish Navy of the 1870s and 1880s might actually be very good examples of this. The German Navy essentially being a glorified coastal defence force until Wilhelm decided it wanted to be a global battle fleet. Then you've got what I would term minimalist force, which is essentially what do we need - what can we afford to maintain whatever bits and pieces of colonial empire we actually still have left. And into this you'd have things like the Portuguese, to a certain extent the Spanish definitely in the 1870s and 1880s. And that is essentially, we know that we cannot afford to play on the top tier tables anymore, but we have these legacy holdings which could be threatened or maybe of interest to either other old established powers that are still around like Britain and France, or new and upcoming powers like the US. And so you end up with what I would describe as a variant of a local control fleet, but whereas with a local control fleet you're concentrating it all in one area for one very specific purpose, with the minimalist fleet you've got some capital ships, some cruisers, some other small stuff, but it's scattered all across the planet. Essentially you're trying to seem at least much bigger and much more nasty than you actually are in order to deter people from coming and taking the last bits of your empire. And then similar to that, but without the overseas colonial trappings, you would also have what I would term the prestige fleet. And this is a fleet that exists and may actually have a certain degree of power to it, at least at the second and third tiers of nations, but ultimately doesn't really have a huge amount of purpose for the size and capability that it actually is at. Because in large part it exists basically to make the ruler of the country feel good about themselves. So for this, you'd be looking at countries that have no particular overseas holdings to defend, have no particular major grudges against anyone else nearby who has any kind of significant naval assets in and of themselves, but will still go out and buy a big ironclad or two in the 1870s just so they can look really cool and important. Now, of course, you might be immediately thinking of navies like the Russians and the French, before the French adopted the Jeune Ecole, who don't necessarily fit into this. Or perhaps the United States, which after the American Civil War, Congress has gone, you don't get to have a navy anymore, or at least done their level best to try and do so. But if in many ways you'll find that although they don't fit into one of those five categories immediately, most of the time those navies are trying to fit into one of those categories. They just haven't necessarily got there yet because they're in the middle of some kind of big overhaul or change. Mike Hall asks, in Drydock 398, your answer to the question about the number of frigates needed to take on a ship of the line reminded me of your account of the conventions that cover the allowed behaviour of frigates in major battles. The first part of my question is, what behaviour is allowed before a frigate qualifies as a target for a ship of the line? Firing first is obviously a no-no, but what about towing a disabled ship of the line out of danger to prevent it being taken as a prize? or perhaps towing it into a firing position so that it can continue the fight. And secondly, what did frigate captains feel about this? It seems obvious they will, at least mostly, not get involved in a firefight like the Nile or Trafalgar, but my impression is that in other circumstances they were a good deal more adventurous. This was obviously the case where battleships had suffered damage. For example, the French frigate that pursued the Audacious after her engagement in the preliminaries of the glorious 1st of June, Monarcha's escape after the moonlight battle being thwarted by HMS Apollo, etc. But was it common for frigates to harass a ship of the line, as seems to have happened at Cape Ortegal? Generally speaking, for frigates to go after ships of the line, one of three things, and ideally two or possibly even all three, should be occurring. One would be the ship of the line is very heavily damaged, or for whatever reason is otherwise unable to bring the majority of its firepower to bear. Two, the frigate has some rather heavier hitting friends in the offing, so it doesn't need to win necessarily, just needs to harass and slow them down so that the big hitters can come in. Or there is something that is impeding the ship of the line from bringing its otherwise full firepower to bear. So obviously if it's damaged or if there's heavy weather, that's one thing, but the weather conditions might theoretically be fine for the ship of the line to deliver a devastating broadside, but some other condition is stopping it. For example, they're towing another ship of the line, and therefore they can't really maneuver. So add one or more of those situations in, and yes, the more adventurous and well-skilled frigate captains will have a go if they think it's reasonable. And obviously that is a very subjective value judgment. So, for example, when Santissima Trinidad, not at Trafalgar, but in one of her earlier battles while she's being towed off, she gets repeatedly shot up by a British frigate that is following her. It's just nowhere near enough firepower to actually force the surrender again, in that case, of the Santissima Trinidad, especially when there's another ship of the line towing it, which, if things get annoying enough, could cast off and come after the frigate. And most frigate captains were fairly sanguine about, not getting completely stuck in to a ship of the line action, because when ships of the line, especially in large numbers, went toe-to-toe with each other, if you were a frigate, which would therefore have fewer guns and lighter guns, you were very, very conscious of just how much iron was being thrown around nearby. One thing that immediately jumps to mind for some reason is that scene in the King Kong movie, the relatively recent one. I think it was the Skull Island one, maybe? Anyway, the one with Jack Black in it. But when the heroine of the film is crawling away, I think through a log, while Kong and the V-Rexes are absolutely going ham immediately above her. That is basically, imagine the frigate with two ships of the line fighting nearby. That's basically the experience if you get too close. But in terms of the first part of your question, if a frigate was towing a ship of the line into position so that the ship of the line could continue its fight, that would definitely open the frigate up to being engaged, although whether it would be engaged at that point is admittedly a little bit open to question, because it would depend, I think, on how close the ship of the line is to being able to engage, because obviously that is the bigger and more immediate threat. So you might start shooting at that just to get a few free broadsides in before it can bring itself into action. If, however, it's clear that that ship of the line will be completely out of position if the frigate can be dissuaded at this point, then yeah, you would probably have absolute license to shoot at the frigate because it is engaging in some form of at least semi-direct defensive action. In terms of towing a disabled battleship out of danger, that would be somewhat circumstantial. If the battleship or the ship of the line has already surrendered and the frigate is trying to take it away, then it would absolutely be straight up shot at, because, well, if nothing else, you're helping a surrendered vessel break its surrender, which is a big no-no, or at least very heavily frowned upon. But if the ship of the line is, let's say, just disabled or crippled, and the frigate has showed up to haul it off, that would be a bit more borderline. I mean, obviously a lot of these were conventions. They weren't necessarily strictly written down in hard copy that everybody agreed to. But I would suspect if a ship of the line was still operational and a frigate started towing it away because it was in some way diminished, I think the enemy would probably continue to shoot at the ship of the line rather than at the frigate. They might take some pot shots at the frigate, but the ship of the line would probably be seen as far more the legitimate target, because if you can force the ship of the line to surrender, then theoretically the frigate should honour that and let it be, rather than you have to shoot up the frigate while the ship of the line potentially can still shoot back at you, because the most likely circumstances of that is if, say, a bunch of the masts have come down on the ship of the line, that doesn't make its guns any less lethal, so you're probably still going to be shooting at the ship of the line in that case. Elite Corsair asks, did or why didn't the US Navy use mines to block Japanese access through the slot to Guadalcanal and other islands in the Solomon Island chain? Couldn't PT boats have dropped a couple when they weren't otherwise able to be on station? There was some limited mining operation carried out around the Guadalcanal area and the slot. However, there were quite a number of factors that mitigated against this, A, being particularly effective, and B, being expanded all that much. So part of it was the fact that closer in, both navies wanted to use the relevant waters. So if you're the US Navy, you might go, okay, well, this area has a Japanese supply ship movement either about to happen or has happened recently, so they might do it again. Yeah, sure, we could put mines there. But then you might want to conduct a covert landing or a gunfire support mission or an actual straight-up amphibious landing or any number of other things in that area immediately afterwards. Or if the front line advances on land, that might be a place where you want to land supplies. And the Japanese are obviously thinking the same thing, just in reverse and in Japanese. So there's relatively little point in mining an area that your own ships might be using maybe 24, 48 hours later, or you hope at least a few weeks later. Expanding that further out, there's also the fact that a lot of the waters around Guadalcanal and down the slot, while obviously there are islands, an awful lot of those waters are extremely deep, because that's the way Pacific Islands tend to go, and moored mines therefore are of no use in water that's several thousand feet deep, or even several hundred feet deep a lot of the time. And in the limited areas where there are shallows, there also tend to be fairly strong currents, which are another fairly major menace to moored mines. So any mine laying effort you did do, again outside of very specific areas, is probably not going to be there for all that long, and also might end up being washed into your area of operations as unmoored mines, which are all sorts of fun to try and deal with. And there was another element as well, which was that certainly in the early part of the Guadalcanal campaign, they were desperate to try and get everything that floated to either fight for control of the seas around Guadalcanal or to take supplies to the men who were fighting on the island. And so if you had a mine layer or a hybrid mine layer of some description, which there were a few of operating in the Guadalcanal area, almost all the time people went, hey, look, you're designed to carry a whole bunch of cargo on or in your vessel. Guess what? We're sticking a whole bunch of cargo on or in your vessel. And yeah, I know your cargo is supposed to normally be round, spiky explosives, but now it's boxes of supplies and ammunition, and you're taking it to the men fighting on Guadalcanal. Have fun. Once the situation eases up to a point that they can lay mines, or they've got a few spare craft around, as I said, there are some minefields laid, but the areas where they can lay them, for all the reasons just outlined above, are very limited. Nosdormu89 asks, which of the major powers came closest to matching the Royal Navy in parity that isn't the Americans, and what would this power have needed to do to actually get there? That, at least in the time period that the channel mostly covers, obviously if you get the further and further you go back, you get to periods like the Armada, when obviously the Spanish Navy is massively in excess of the Royal Navy. But if you're talking about the period when the Royal Navy is kind of the biggest navy in the world, who gets closest to challenging them, and isn't the United States, it would be the French in the Revolutionary Napoleonic War period in particular. Now, while the active French fleet is smaller than the Royal Navy for the majority of that period, once they supplement themselves by allying with the Spanish, the Royal Navy does have some significant issues, because combined, the Franco-Spanish fleet could be a major threat. It could certainly achieve local superiority to the Royal Navy elements in, say, European waters. A straight-up lineup of every single ship that the Spanish and the French have in their possession versus every single ship the British have in their possession would be an interesting one, but a completely hypothetical, because, of course, both navy, well, all three navies have vast numbers of ships scattered across the planet. The British perhaps more so than the others, but whatever. But my general point is that the French ability to build warships during the 1780s, 1790s, 1800s really isn't to be sniffed at. Yes, they did lose quite a number of major naval battles, and that kind of helped because obviously the Royal Navy has this habit of not just taking French ships, but then adding them to their own. So every ship that's lost in that manner actually has a double effect, because it's not just -1 to the French, it's -1 to the French and usually +1 to the British, which helps the British immensely. But even after a good number of their ships of the line have been taken out at various battles, including obviously the Nile and Trafalgar and so forth, the French keep building new ships. And that's why, although the big naval battles are pretty much done and dusted after Trafalgar in the Napoleonic Wars, in the intervening 10 years between then and Napoleon finally being defeated, there's still a huge amount of activity by the Royal Navy, because the French are still building frigates and sending them out to fight. They're still building ships of the line and trying to build up a new battle fleet. And the Royal Navy is spending a huge amount of effort trying to make sure that the French don't build up a new battle fleet. That's obviously by building up their own battle fleet still further, but also a huge amount of blockade to keep what ships the French have been able to build scattered into smaller pockets, where if any individual force sails, it's only going to be half a dozen ships or so they can be dealt with, and also by a series of raids to capture or destroy ships that are either in harbour or are just under construction or whatever, which obviously, again, massively reduces the French numbers. But for every ship that they capture or burn, it seems the French have another one on the slipways. And so the Royal Navy is essentially playing whack-a-mole with French warships throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic War period, because if they stop and just rely on, hey, we're building our ships, they're building their ships, with nothing else, otherwise influencing the total count, they're fairly well aware that the French very well could outbuild them. Clayton Bradish asks, so with the Channel Dash, which is incidentally one of my favourite videos, I was wondering, was the defence as outlined sufficient? Would you have set it up differently? Or was it just subpar execution and bad luck combined with the audacity of the German attempt that made for the German success in the operation? Well, on paper, the defences set up should have been sufficient to stop the Germans, or at least badly impair them. Obviously, that didn't happen, so in practice that wasn't the case. But as kind of outlined in the video, there were multiple failings. So I think if there were two major failings in the British defences, it wasn't their on-paper strength, it was more redundancy and cooperation. So the first failure, obviously, was the submarine that was supposed to watch the harbour having to draw off for a little bit, and that unknowingly for the Germans, but still very luckily for them, gave them the opportunity to slip out without being immediately spotted. So if they'd had two submarines there, just in case something goes wrong with one of them, then they would have known the Germans were coming a lot sooner than they did. And then you have the aerial recon. Now, admittedly, that was just sheer bad luck. You can't catch everything with aerial recon. So much as it would be tempting to say double up the aerial recon patrols, I don't think that would be as practical, especially on a long-term basis, as, say, going, okay, we'll have two submarines off for port instead. And then as things progress up the channel, this is where coordination starts to come into play, because you have torpedo bombers, you have regular bombers, you have RAF Coastal Command torpedo bombers, in addition to the small flight of swordfishes that are actually sent out. You have the destroyers, you have MTBs, etc., etc. You have all the components necessary such that if they were coordinated, there's very little chance in my mind that the German formation would make it through unscathed. If you've got an attack by half a dozen to a dozen torpedo-armed destroyers making a run-in at you from head-on, while you've got MTBs and MGBs circling and prowling and nipping at all quarters, and you're being deluged with bombs from, admittedly fairly ineffective, level bombing techniques, and you have more than half a dozen torpedo bombers coming in, and you coordinate several large fighter units to come in to cover them and just disrupt the German air cover generally, collectively that should be more than enough to put some torpedoes into some German capital units, and probably take out some of the small craft as well. Now, admittedly, things could be beefed up somewhat, and indeed they were after the Channel Dash itself, and of course you have the coastal guns at Dover perhaps doing a slightly better job of things, but ultimately, even with the late notice that the Germans were coming up the channel, what was left to be launched still theoretically could have pulled off a fairly devastating strike if the coordination between the RAF, the Royal Navy, and all the various departments therein was actually well put together and executed. That was the single biggest weakness there. Plus, of course, to a certain extent at the time, there was this thought of, well, we'll put all this stuff in just in case the Germans come up, but really they're not going to come up. No one will be that mad. Oh, wait, they actually are. I mean, the only other thing I would do, apart from increasing, obviously, coordination, would be that if I'd had two submarines off the coast and I was off the port where the Germans came out of originally, and I therefore knew they were coming a bit more in advance, as well as getting all those level bombers in for, admittedly, mostly a distraction attack on the fleet, the first thing I would have done would actually be to load them up with a ton of mines, or at least all the ones that can be, and just rather admittedly haphazardly and randomly, but still, drop mines in the path of the German advance. Peter Dasso asks, as a fellow HEMA-ist, I'm curious which naval swords from history you'd be most interested to spar with. Well, obviously, if you go back far enough to kind of the medieval period, you're just looking at regular land-based swords just having been taken out to sea. But if you get into the, shall we say, post-1600s period, when you start to see naval pattern swords emerging more and more, and I apologise to regular listeners if some of this sounds a little bit opaque, but we are in a realm that I do have a great deal of fun in, even if obviously don't talk about it hugely on the channel. I think a naval cutlass would be a really interesting thing to spar with, mostly because although it looks in some ways very similar to various other swords of the period, it is of course its own thing, and I think would make for a very interesting weapon because it's got a lot of hand protection. Perhaps I would say, certainly if you're looking at the classic naval cutlass, perhaps a bit more hand protection than a regular sparring saber, or at least slightly different, but it's going to be a very differently balanced weapon. And I know Paul Binns has recently started making some pretty darn good HEMA safe cutlasses, and I actually have one on order. So random shout out, if you happen to be going to fight camp towards the end of July, I think he might have a few there. He's certainly going to be making one that he'll be bringing for me, and of course I'll be there, so all fun and games. That's over at Newbury Showground in the UK. Big HEMA event for those of you who have no idea what the heck I was just talking about. But also, I mean, that would probably be my main historical naval sword, but the other thing is I now have several 20th century, late 19th century naval officers' swords, and of course by that point, outside of very rare things like the boarding of Altmark, naval officers aren't using their swords all that much. I'd be really interested to see how they actually shape up in combat sparring, obviously. Now, some of those swords, although they may look very similar or identical, some of them are full-on service weapons, as in you could fight with them very comfortably. Some of the more recent ones, I suspect, having seen them, some are probably still perfectly combat capable. Others are basically pretty wall hangers that would probably snap if you actually try to hit anyone with them. But I would be interested to see if somebody could, take, I'd say probably a late 19th, early 20th century naval officer's sword, a typical pattern one, and recreate something that had the same balance, weight, and overall appearance, but with a HEMA-safe blade, just to see how this sort of final form of the British naval officer's sword actually shapes up if you try to use it as a sword. Brendan Buersdorf asks, the British used an anti-submarine howitzer in both 7.5 and 11-inch versions in World War I, and the Japanese had 120mm and 200mm anti-submarine howitzers in World War II. How effective were these guns, and what ships were they commonly deployed on in both navies? I've seen some photos of the British setups, but I'd be curious if you had any pictures of the Japanese setups, at least on ships. Well, I can only find one picture of a 120mm Japanese naval howitzer. I can find loads of pictures of the 200mm one and a reasonable number of the 120s, but they're all land-based. The 200mm was very much in favour by the Japanese part. I don't know exactly why, possibly just desperation, but for whatever reason they really, really liked it as a coastal defence gun. Anyway, in terms of general effectiveness of these naval howitzers, this example is a slightly higher quality image of a 7.5-inch British version. They had three main advantages. Firstly, they were sort of available, could be made very quickly, especially with the World War I variants. So something is better than nothing. Secondly, of course, being howitzers, they're somewhat short range, but they are somewhat multi-purpose. So yes, you can use them to shoot at submarines, but you can also use them to shoot at other surface targets, so enemy merchant raiders and, well, people tried to land on beaches you'd rather they didn't if you're using them as a coastal defence weapon. There's even some talk of them potentially, at least the Japanese versions, being used as anti-aircraft weapons, but with rather limited effect, which I suppose in terms of can throw explosive thing into sky at flying object, yes. Not that I think they'd be particularly good at tracking or loading fast enough to be truly effective, but there you go. Maybe against a flying boat or a bomber or something like that. But the other advantage that they have when you're fighting against submarines is that, of course, they can be used against surfaced submarines, whereas depth charge launchers can't, for the most part, because depth charges arm themselves in part by hitting the water, and there's many cases where depth charges were dropped or launched against submarines on the surface, and they hit the submarine, and then they fall off, or roll off, and detonate further down. So multi-purpose, cheap and easy, and can engage surface targets. And potentially you could add into that can engage surface targets at a somewhat reasonable range. I mean, they are howitzers after all. They're not going to be engaging at anything like the ranges that full naval guns are capable of, but they can fire out to a few thousand yards as opposed to a few hundred feet if you're lucky with most depth charge launchers. But the big downside is that unless the submarine is literally right below the surface, I wouldn't even say periscope depth, less than periscope depth, these howitzers are not really that effective against submarines under the water because, well, they're firing shells, and yes, there might be modified shells, but they don't act like depth charges do. They don't have hydrostatic fuses. They have just a 2-second delay or a 1-second delay, depending on the shell, and that's not going to get very far underwater. So if you're being attacked, especially in World War I, they perhaps make more sense when submarines tend to attack quite often on the surface, and in World War II, submarines will sometimes stalk or catch up with or chase you on the surface, so they do have a use, but essentially the more and more the submarines move towards actually attacking underwater, the less and less effective these things become. And so outside of immediate emergency use in World War I, when they are the only things going, by the time of World War II, you generally see them mounted only on merchant ships and perhaps on really tertiary line escorts, where essentially it's much easier to train somebody in, here is a howitzer, this is how you load the howitzer, this is how you point the howitzer, and this is how you shoot the howitzer. Training a gun crew for simple ASW howitzer operation is somewhat simpler and, to be honest, a little bit safer than stocking a whole bunch of depth charges and depth charge launchers and all the equipment for that, and expecting people to operate that. Because at that point, it's not just about the people on the depth charge launcher, it's also about the crew maneuvering the ship. And if you're on a big merchant ship, you should not be maneuvering to try and depth charge a submarine. At best, you should be, oh, there's a submarine 2,000 yards away, it might be coming in to attack us, let's take some pot shots at it to make it go away. Leave the charging down the enemy and dropping explosives on their heads, for the most part, to the escort vessels. And even if you could have come up with some kind of howitzer launch depth charge, and ultimately, what is a depth charge launcher in World War II except for a slightly evolved mortar? But the howitzer shells that were used by these things tended to have relatively weak explosive charges. Now, that's not really a problem if you're punching a shell into the hull of a submarine and then it explodes. But if you're trying to destroy the submarine with the blast effect of the munition, which is obviously what you're trying to do underwater, they would typically have an explosive charge that's anything from 4 or 5 times or anything up to 8 or 10 times weaker than the charge that would be found in a given depth charge. And so even, as I said, even if you could make a sinking shell, it wouldn't really be of much use. Matt Blom asks, can you explain why steel from the scuttled Imperial German Navy at Scapa Flow was so valuable? I thought I heard partially it was something to do with the fact that the metal wasn't affected by radioactive isotopes caused by nuclear bomb detonations, but I'm confused on the mechanisms of this if true. Yeah, so broadly that's the case. So essentially the problem is that if you are producing steel, which is obviously an alloy of, at its core, iron and carbon, but obviously with most steels there's various other trace elements thrown in there as well, but the process to create the steel, melting it down, etc., involves the use of a vast amount of air in the processes used to make steel up until kind of the middle of the Cold War-ish, and then they switch over to oxygen, which is obviously somewhat more efficient, but the oxygen is drawn from the air, the general atmosphere. And the problem is, ever since the Trinity test, there have been trace amounts of radioactive materials from both the Trinity tests, the usage of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all the subsequent nuclear testing that was done afterwards by various nations. And all of that got up into the air. Now, for the most part, day to day, this small increase in natural background radiation is relatively irrelevant, partly because it's a small percentage increase over the natural background radiation that we get from just being underneath the sun, as well as various fun emissions from the ground, like down in Cornwall you have to worry about radon coming up out of the ground. But it's not the general background radiation that's the problem, it's the fact that this particular element of it is airborne. And so when you are using vast amounts of air or oxygen that's been derived from the air in your steelmaking process, even if the chance of any particular cubic foot or cubic meter of air containing one of or more of these little radioactive trace particles from nuclear explosions is very, very small, you end up using so much air or oxygen that you do end up imparting a reasonable amount of this trace background airborne radiation into the steel that you are making. Now again, the amount that's actually being then generated and given off by the steel is minuscule and by and large does not matter. You build a car out of it, build your house out of it, build a ship out of it, doesn't really make much odds. It's not dangerous to people. What it is a problem for is things that detect radiation. Geiger counters, certain types of imaging device, etc. Because, of course, for those things, you want to be only measuring a specific kind of radiation, whether that's some kind of scanning device, or whether, as in a medical scanning device, or it's some kind of perhaps industrial scanning device that's looking for micro cracks and fissures in manufactured components, or, as I said, Geiger counters, things that are actually measuring radiation in some way, especially very low levels of radiation, trace radiation. So looking for very small radioactive leaks in places like nuclear reactors, or even imaging systems like the ones they use where they inject you with a radioactive dye and watch it percolate through your body, which obviously the radiation levels have to be pretty low for that to be safe to use. And the fundamental problem is if you use modern steel in constructing even something as simple as the casing for those components, or some internal element of the detector, then because the steel is giving off a very small amount of radiation, the detector is always going to detect that radiation. So if you, let's say for sake of example, we're in the middle of the 1970s and 1980s, and you made a Geiger counter and you switched it on and it started going, either beep or just fizzing gently in the background the way that they do, you could encase it in a cubic kilometre of lead, make it proof to every single external radiation source possible, and dump it at the bottom of the sea, and it would still be detecting the occasional click, because it itself is mildly radioactive. Whereas the steel that you get from steel that's been manufactured before the Second World War and has been then preserved, like, say, being underwater, is obviously manufactured without those problems. So it's low background steel. And thus, if it has any radioactive signature at all, it's going to be so small that it basically is never going to make any difference on any realistic kind of detection. Because obviously the vast majority of the background radiation that's just around day to day on Earth from natural causes is from things like the sun. The sun doesn't beam radioactive particles all the way from Sol to Terra. It's just the radiation itself. The actual particulate matter that's sourcing that radiation is kind of, still with the sun for the most part. And so for very delicate measuring instruments, you can make the steel components out of low background steel, and then they will actually give you values that reflect the surrounding environment and not what they themselves are giving off. But of course, since the steel industry in part operates on taking in scrap old steel and recycling it, like, say, all those wonderful battleships that were built and then scrapped after the Second World War, which also would have been, for the most part, decent sources of low background steel. By the time anyone realised this was actually going to be a problem, there were very, very few places you could get decent high-quality steel in any kind of significant amounts that had been manufactured pre-World War II, and one of the biggest sources of that was the German wrecks at Scapa Flow. Now, since, for the moment at least, people have stopped exploding nuclear weapons every so often, the level of man-made background radiation has fallen, and so some of the need for low background steel has diminished, because whatever traces are left are outside the boundaries of what they need to worry about, but it is still useful in some very high-end detection systems. Ash the Lego guy asks, how complex of a process was it to deploy and retract the torpedo defense nets of the pre-dreadnaught and dreadnaught-era ships? Was there a way to jettison the nets or booms if the ship needed to get moving immediately, or were the nets not much of a drag hindrance as a ship was just getting moving, at least long enough to get them stowed properly? And how many cases were there of nets successfully stopping a torpedo in battle? So this goes through several evolutions, both obviously initially when people develop torpedo netting for ships in the first place, and then after it kind of mostly goes away during the First World War, it then comes back on some ships in World War II, but in a much lesser form. So if we assume we're talking about the classic immediate run-up to World War I, World War I setting, as seen here with Seydlitz, then deploying the booms was actually a relatively easy process. You can see they're fastened to the ship at the lower end of the angle of the booms when they're in storage mode. So the way they would normally do this is you would unlock the various ropes or chains, depending on your setup, that were holding the netting on its little shelf in a rolled up state. That gets shoved over, so the netting rolls down immediately, and then you would also obviously unlatch or unleash the booms at the top, and the weight of the netting, which is obviously then dragging outwards, combined with the fact the pivot point is downwards, would mean that the whole thing would essentially just swing out into place. Now, each of the booms does have usually 2 to 3 lines attached, so it'll have, if you imagine if you're looking from the top down, each boom will have a line leading back to the ship on a port angle and a starboard angle, and many will also have a vertical one, each forming triangles, and that allows you to more finely adjust the exact angle of the boom, and obviously gives you something to haul the thing back in with afterwards as well. But the actual initial deployment is done quite a lot under gravity. When you want to get the thing back, you obviously do it all in reverse, but these are not your average fishing net. These are steel nets. They have to be to stop a multi-ton torpedo travelling at highway speeds. So it's all quite heavy. You're not going to be hauling it back in by hand, certainly not without vast numbers of people. And so what they tended to do was, again, depending on the ship, either use davit cranes, specialist davits, or very often the capstans, and that would provide the motive power by pulling on the lines that were stabilizing the booms to haul the booms back in again, and then they'd be brought up to roughly the position you see here, and then you'd have to haul up the actual netting. So the netting, if you imagine them almost like reverse sails in a way, they've got their own lines attached to them, which obviously you can then bring up and start folding and rolling it all up. And again, that process would usually also be mechanically assisted. Again, you could do it with manpower, but it would be very, very unforgiving if you had to, and a lot slower. In terms of jettisoning the nets and booms if the ship needed to get moving immediately, yes, in theory you could do, because the netting is attached to the booms, so you can cut those attachment points. Getting rid of the booms themselves is a bit more difficult because they are obviously installed quite strongly with steel attachments and hinges because, well, they've got to support all the weight that's attached to those points. But you've got to remember that when a ship needs to get moving, unless it's already fired up, it's going to take a while to build up the head of steam. And in that time, it's relatively easy to bring the booms back in. And if you were told to be on hot standby to deploy at any moment, you almost certainly wouldn't have your booms out. If they did end up being out for whatever reason, as long as you weren't moving particularly fast, they weren't a massive hindrance, but they did tend to find that they cut the ship speed substantially once you started trying to move at any great speed because of the drag. So, if you were told, okay, you need to get moving and the fleet's assembling here, and maybe for whatever reason, maybe you're just switching over boilers, the boilers the boilers are running hot, and for whatever hand-wavy, unlikely but plausible reason, you're actually in a position to get underway before somebody's got around to removing the torpedo booms. If all you need to do is move at 8 to 10 knots down a channel to meet up with the rest of your formation, and then wait for the rest of the fleet to organise itself, then yeah, you could do that and haul the nets back in. If you're told we need to get moving at 18, 20 knots ASAP, the nets have to come in before you start moving. In terms of the nets successfully stopping a torpedo in battle, well, the thing was, because of that drag issue, which was evident right from the very moment they were installed, as far as I'm aware, at least certainly in the case of late pre-dreadnaughts and early dreadnoughts, no one actually went into battle with them, as opposed to just, being in port with them deployed and therefore relatively stationary. Stationary torpedo nets and booms, mounted ships, did catch quite a lot of torpedoes over time, but if they're not being really used in battle, although that was initially the idea, but the drag proved too much. Sam Signorelli asks, Warspite and Enterprise are legendary for what they did and endured during World War II. What ships from other belligerents have a similar legend? I wouldn't really include Bismarck, Tirpitz, or any of the Amateurs, since, of course, most of them didn't really do anything, or only had one real battle, and they ended up being sunk anyway. I'm talking about ships that got stuck into the fight multiple times. In terms of sheer survival, I would look at something like Yukikaze, which seems to show up like the proverbial bad penny at almost every major engagement and just waltzes away while the rest of the Japanese formation around her burns merrily to the ground, or should I say to the waterline. Shigure obviously is almost as bad in that respect, but Shigure at least has the good grace to be torpedoed and sunk right at the very end of the war. For the Germans, Prince Eugen would probably be a decent candidate. And admittedly, she doesn't get stuck in every single month during the war, but she has a relatively active career and she's present on a number of missions and in a number of theatres where basically every other large German capital unit involved in that area is either badly damaged or sunk, either in that operation or very shortly thereafter. I mean, she accompanies Bismarck. Bismarck gets sunk. Prince Eugen doesn't. She goes on the Channel dash. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau both get mined. Prince Eugen survives. She goes up to the north, which is basically where German capital ships go to die, because obviously Tirpitz gets bombed. Scharnhorst gets sunk at the Battle of North Cape. And she's the only substantially above 10,000-ton German ship to come back from there and live. Hipper goes up there for a little bit, gets damaged, comes back, gets bombed. Then Prince Eugen goes into the Baltic, shoots up a bunch of Soviet troops, gets attacked repeatedly, gets back to Germany, and ends up surviving to become nuclear weapons test fodder. Although if you want to go into ships that see a fair bit of action and maybe have a reputation for survival, but allow for the fact that maybe they didn't at the end, you could look at something like Scharnhorst, because she goes out on Operation Berlin. She's obviously involved in the Channel Dash. She takes out HMS Glorious. She fights Renown. And although she walks away from quite a few of these operations and engagements with damage, she picks herself back up and heads back out again. Of course, then her luck runs out at North Cape. And in an iconic mirror match, since, of course, Scharnhorst more clearly parallels Warspite, since it's the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine facing off against each other, with the US Navy facing off against the Imperial Japanese Navy. Enterprise's closest equivalent is in fact another carrier, Zuikaku, which is around for an awful lot of various confrontations and somehow always manages to survive, again up until the Battle of Cape Engano, when she doesn't. John McDonough asks, I was randomly perusing David Brown's Warship Losses of World War II when a small entry caught my eye. On September 9th, 1943, the Italian minelayer Pelagosa was sunk 7 miles off Genoa by what was described as German artillery. What type of artillery, i.e. was it coast defences or field artillery, as that wasn't specified in the entry? My question therefore has 3 parts. Given that Pelagosa was small, 550 tons and just over 200 foot long, and fleeing about as quickly as she could, okay, only about 10 knots, and about just over 12,000 yards away, was this remarkably good shooting even for a well-trained coastal artillery battery? And would it be near miraculous shooting for a field artillery battery whose usual targets don't move in 3 dimensions? So I did a bit more digging into this, and I discovered that she was engaged by the guns of the Monte Moro coastal defence installation, so that answers one part of the question. And now, as far as that the installation is concerned, obviously it was a dedicated coastal defence installation built by the Italians before the Germans took it over, so it had all the appropriate rangefinder and fire control equipment aboard, or built in, I guess, and it had 3 main batteries. A small gun battery, which is rather irrelevant, I think, for this incident. By the way, this isn't a picture of the Pelagosa, it's another Italian minelayer, closest I could find. But it also had a 6-inch battery and a 15-inch battery, which were actually guns that had been proposed for use on the Francesco Caracciolo class, which obviously had been cancelled and repurposed. So at that point, at about 12,000 yards, hitting a 10-knot target with full rangefinder and fire control equipment, for 6-inch guns, if it was the 6-inch battery, because I wasn't able to find out which battery actually scored the hits, but for 6-inch guns, that would be decent performance. You'd expect them to be able to hit guns at that, or hit targets at that kind of range with those guns. So it wouldn't be particularly remarkable, but also it would demonstrate that the gunners at least knew what they were doing. But for a 15-inch battery, hitting at about 12,000 yards with full rangefinder and fire control equipment from a completely stationary firing position should have been pretty much dead easy, near enough shooting fish in a barrel. On the other hand, if it was the smaller guns, well, they could theoretically range out that far, but at that point it would actually be quite a remarkable feat of gunnery for them to hit a moving target out that far. But given that they had the 3 batteries, that's why I'm relatively speaking doubtful it was that smaller battery. Could be wrong, though. E.K. Bellinger asks, the wounded men of USS Marblehead were rescued by someone near Titilyadap. I can't pronounce the thing. Anyway, according to your USS Marblehead video a few years back, you said that was a story worth telling. If the topic is too far down your queue, where could I find said story? Probably the best place to find it is this book, Escape from Java, The Extraordinary World War II Story of the USS Marblehead by John J. Domolgalski, because, well, it's an entire book that is dedicated purely to Marblehead's escape voyage. It's not even a general history of the ship, although obviously it does start out with a basic history from Keel Lake to how she ended up in this situation. But the main focus of the book is just that escape voyage, so it does contain a reasonable amount of detail about their rescue and escape, that is, the escape of the wounded crew, as well as, obviously, like all good books, references to where you can look up more details about specific elements of it. Fitch's Fifth Fleet Fish Fleecer Fiercely Fishing for Fleeting Fish for 4 Fish Fritter Flavour Favours asks, considering YouTube is using videos to train AI, what do you think will happen to your channel in the next few years if realistic AI Drachs start to appear in the wild? It's happened to a few of the more popular YouTube channels out there and has always been very hard for them to stamp out. Well, I'll kind of refer you to my answer to the first question at the start of this Drydock, but essentially, if there end up being AIs out there that are straight up copying my work, then, and I know there are some already trying, then essentially I would ask for the help of you lot to hunt them down so that I can kill them. In broader overall terms of, as AI advances, etc., well, first of all, it would have to advance to the point it can actually do proper research rather than just regurgitating what it's seen and learned. And the thing is, as most of you probably know, for every decent channel on a given subject, there are probably 4 dozen terrible ones that just regurgitate the same pop culture history. And unless somebody is being very, very selective about how they're training AI on which videos, etc., the statistical chance is that the AI will still regurgitate stupid, wrong information. So, for example, it might look up my theory on how Hood was destroyed. But if it is trying to sort of go, okay, well, if it's just scraping YouTube, it's going to go, okay, well, how many other videos are there on on Hood's destruction? And look through all of them, and the vast majority of them are all going to be going, plunging fire, insufficient ammunition handling procedures, all the tired old tropes, because that's precisely because they're the tired old tropes. Lots of dumb channels, whether they be human or AI, just repeat that. And so the AI is going to look and go, well, this channel, and maybe 1 or 2 others say this, which is obviously my channel and a couple of other good naval history channels, and then this vast array of other channels, which we know are slop, it doesn't, are all saying, oh, it's plunging fire, or it's like invincible at Jutland, and it's probably then going to say, oh yeah, that this is why Hood blew up, at which point I was going, who knows anything about it, is going to go, yeah, sure, whatever, buddy, moving on quickly. But even if they get a bit better at working out what's true and what's false, although that could be a considerable threat to the channel, because of course AI of that advanced a level can generate and spit out videos far, far faster than any human can ever do, and for cheaper as well, I think there still will be a certain element where I would still have an advantage over the AI. And that is simply that when it comes to naval history, there are large amounts of both information and interpretation that just can't be done by scraping videos and websites. Because, for one thing, there are some circumstances and times, places, battles, etc., where there isn't a set answer that the AI can learn and then regurgitate. There are multiple differing opinions, and if you want to back one or the other or come up with your own, you have to look at all of those and then essentially show your working or display your reasoning to the audience. And I don't think the AI is at a point where it can really do that. So, while I keep citing it quite often, it's because I was tearing my hair out trying to work out what the heck actually happened when I did this particular video, the Battle of Actium. Even if the AI finds every one of the 4 main sources about Actium online, those 4 are all contradictory. And then it's down to, can the AI be advanced enough to actually reason a consistent scenario out of those, weighting everything on plausibility and knowledge of the time, the period, the environment, the authors, etc., which is what you have to do to synthesize a theoretical Battle of Actium, which is what the only thing anyone can actually present. And can it actually do that? At the moment, I don't think so. In the future, maybe it can, but I'd be very surprised. And the other thing is what I would term offline research, because there's a huge amount of information that just isn't online. And, some of you who've watched the channel for quite a while will have come across me essentially publicizing that information. For example, as far as I'm aware, there's no particular great detail sources online or indeed written in secondary literature about the British interwar fleet exercises. There are some decent secondary sources, i.e. people have written up reports and stuff on the US Navy's fleet problems, but when it comes to the interwar British fleet exercises, apart from maybe the occasional single scenario that's mentioned because it's critical to one particular argument or another, there isn't really a write-up of what actually was going on in the Royal Navy. All that information is still pretty much locked up in the archives. Now, I've gone in and scanned several years' worth of the Royal Navy fleet exercises, and I've put some of those out as videos, and I've still got a bunch more just from that original scan trip to put out at some point in the future. The AI can't go into the National Archives, request those documents and scan them because it's a purely online entity. So I will still be able to present stuff that the AI doesn't even know exists, let alone has access any access to any significant information on. So I think there is still hope, but obviously we'll just have to see how things go. Jeffrey Conley asks, there are photos of the armoured cruiser USS Washington in port during World War II showing she was still around, albeit in reserve. My question is, would it have been possible, and was the ship large enough in the early to mid-1930s, to refit it as an anti-aircraft training ship to test the various guns the US Navy would be using in the coming years? Theoretically, yes, it could have been done. There were actually 2 major modernizations proposed for the Tennessee-class armoured cruisers. USS Washington was eventually renamed to USS Seattle, and that's the name she was going under during World War II. But regardless, the first option that was presented was back in the period surrounding the Washington Naval Treaty in the early 1920s, because they were allowed to keep the Tennessees, and obviously with the other restrictions on existing cruisers, there was a proposal to thoroughly modernise and overhaul the ships to make them obviously quite lethal combatants, but it was judged to cost far too much. And then at the end of the 1920s, there was another proposal, but it was at that point judged cost ineffective compared to the capabilities of the heavy cruisers that they'd be up against, particularly when it came to things like speed. So yes, it was entirely possible to convert them to a more modern role. Was it large enough? Surprisingly, yes. It wasn't at the Seattle at that point, or Washington, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, the armoured cruiser wasn't that far removed lengthwise from USS Utah, which in the mid-1930s was the ship that was chosen to be converted into an anti-aircraft training vessel. However, there are a few caveats to that. While lengthwise, you're looking at a very similar result, the armoured cruiser is somewhat narrower in beam, so there's less overall deck space, which is particularly important when you're looking for numerous smaller guns. And as you'll see in a minute, Utah has a bunch of essentially sponson weapons installed on her for the purpose of training. But also, Utah had already been converted to oil firing during her time in service as an active battleship in the 20s, whereas the armoured cruiser was still running on coal with all these funnels. So whereas taking Utah and converting her was mostly a matter of taking off some of the main battery turrets and remodelling the upper works, to do the armoured cruiser, you would get a somewhat less capable vessel because you've got less surface area to mount deck guns on, and it would cost an awful lot more because you would have to completely gut the ship and redo all her machinery spaces. Whereas, as you can see here, this is Utah right towards what turned out to be the end of her life, and she's already been refitted with 5-inch guns and all sorts of smaller weapons for use as an anti-aircraft training vessel. So this was the option they went with. You physically could have done a similar thing with the Washington-Seattle, but it would have been a lot more expensive and got you a slightly worse product. Actual Sasquatch asks, say the Hellenic Navy somehow obtains the money to do an Italian-style interwar refit of Georgios Averoff. What modifications would you make, and how do you see the Allies using the resulting ship during World War II? Well, first of all, it is important to bear in mind Averoff did get a modernisation in the interwar period. It just wasn't at quite the right time or quite as extensive as would perhaps have been necessary for full use in the Second World War, but in the question, obviously, we're doing the full Italian work style. So just for reference for people who are wondering, this is what Averoff looked like in World War I, and this is how she looked by World War II. Dazzle camouflage scheme aside, you can see she's got a much more substantial rangefinder setup on her foremast, and she has a larger superstructure as well. However, if we're going full works Italian style, then there are a few more changes I could make. And this is kind of a placeholder I put together in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. Don't judge it too harshly because they don't have a Greek nation entry, so this is just for kind of describing roughly what would happen. So I would keep the fore and aft twin 9.2s. I would completely strip out and reboiler and re-engine the ship. So she's going to be considerably quicker, but also with fewer, larger, more powerful boilers. She can go from 3 funnels down to 2, as you can see. Now, one thing I couldn't find was an armoured cruiser hull of roughly the appropriate hull appearance with a raked bow, because of course she has a ram bow in real life. But imagine that there is a raked bow there to help cope with the increased speed, and also, just as with the Italian modernizations, a bow extension, which also is going to change her length to breadth ratio. So she's going to be a faster ship, maybe 27, 28 knots, something like that. You could, in theory, push her further and faster, but that would mean even more of a refit, basically completely rebuilding the ship, including the hull, which is a little bit pointless, because at that point you might as well just build a new one. But the main thing is she's now as fast as a modern fast capital ship, faster than some, and therefore relatively competitive, because obviously she's not trying to fight other capital ships, she's trying to fight other cruisers. And while most modern cruisers are going to be faster than she is, she still has heavier guns, albeit somewhat fewer of them, and she has considerably more armour. But what you might notice is I've completely changed the secondary battery, because the twin 7.5s are fun, but in the world of the Second World War, or the late interwar period when this modernisation is happening, she needs more anti-aircraft guns, and she doesn't need another set of heavy guns to deal with potential targets. Because if she's going up against enemy heavy cruisers, okay, ideally maybe you'd want 6 guns, but 4 9.2s is still enough to do a fair bit of damage. And so, as you can see, I've stuck a whole bunch of secondaries on the side. So 4 twins per side. Ideally, given that we're doing this with Italian modernization style money, ideally I'd send her to the States, which has a certain amount of precedent, because obviously Kiklis and Lemnos are from there. So get them all as 5-inch 38s. And then in the space where the third funnel was, you can see I've stuck a pedestal with another 5-inch 38-ish turret on there. Again, just a placeholder. But I imagine that could be, well, if it's the interwar period, maybe an octuple pom-pom, because obviously Averoff was drawn from many different sources when she was being built, so why not draw from many more sources at the same time now? And you could stick maybe a couple of quad pom-poms up on the bridge and around the stern area, the rear mast, to give her a kind of a good solid medium anti-aircraft battery. So what you've got at that point is a kind of a good all-rounder. She's got a really good lot of anti-aircraft defense, which even in the interwar period is known it would be needed in the Mediterranean because it's a very closed environment with an awful lot of land-based aircraft nearby. She's still got the punch to seriously worry heavy cruisers, easily overwhelm light cruisers, especially with upgraded fire control. She's got the range for it. She's got the armour to tank a lot of hits from whether they be from heavy or light cruisers. And she's got the speed that she can't be run down by most modern capital ships. Of course, the Littorios could, in theory, catch her, but the amount of work you need to get a hull like this up to 30, 32 knots is just a little bit prohibitive. And from a Greek Navy point of view, as I said, it allows her to stand off against Italian cruisers, but it also means if the small Greek fleet gets attacked by massed Italian torpedo boats and destroyers, she has quite the ferocious battery to deal with them as well. As for what she would then be used for in World War II when she escapes the fall of Greece, I anticipate in this layout she would probably end up in Alexandria with Cunningham's Mediterranean fleet, because yes, she can't run with the British light cruisers because they're going to be considerably quicker than she is, but she would make a perfect ship to accompany the main battle force, essentially sticking with the carriers. Because again, she's got the surface firepower to deal with any potential Italian ships that might leak through to threaten the carriers, and we know that the carriers in the Med do stay pretty close to the battle line quite often. She's got more than enough anti-aircraft firepower to greatly assist in keeping the carriers safe. She's faster than any of Cunningham's battleships, so she's not going to have a problem keeping up with the battle fleet at cruising speed, and of course she would also make a really good anti-aircraft escort for convoys. She's big enough she could probably have flag facilities put in, become a convoy escort leader for the Mediterranean fleet's elements in things like Harpoon and Halberd and XS, and with a reasonable turn of speed, possibly even making things like the Tobruk run, because she's fast enough and she's got the firepower to defend herself. And then obviously later stages of the war she'll be doing shore bombardment and anti-aircraft cover work as well during the Sicily landings, the Salerno landings, etc., etc. Stuart Cork asks, in films showing a submarine in combat, we often see during a depth charge attack in a submarine's control room, a leak is sprung, and to fix this someone reaches up to turn a valve off on a pipe in the deckhead. The water stops, there are no puddles on the deck, no sparks from the rather damp electrical equipment. So my question is, how accurate is this to real-life experience during combat? And aside from free showers for the crew during extended sweaty watches, what are these pipes actually designed for that allows them to suddenly spray water at inconvenient times? And if a submarine can cope without them when the valves are closed, why are they there in the first place? So while submarine springing random leaks in the middle of a depth charge attack is not unrealistic, it's also not as common as is made out in films. But obviously in films it serves as a fairly obvious visual dramatic point to say, look, this is a serious danger. And they can't really usually go with there's a leak in the hull, because most of the time if a depth charge attack manages to breach the hull, the pressure hull that is, such that water starts pouring into a control room, it's usually pretty much curtains for the sub in that particular case. But as I said, leaks are not unheard of when a submarine is under depth charge attack, and the various pipes can be for quite a number of things. There is, of course, a system to move water through the sub, which is needed for things like fresh water for cooking in the galley, a certain amount of water for washing, although that is very limited, and of course drinking. Fresh water is also sometimes needed for the batteries, although that doesn't tend to be moved around in pipes. But you also have quite a number of transfer pipes for the ballast tanks, both for pumping water around the sub to change its trim, but also to allow water into the ballast tanks, and obviously then to allow air through to expel water from the ballast tanks when the sub needs to dive or to rise. And the reason those pipes run through the control room is because most often the control valves, or at least some of the control valves, because they usually are duplicates, at least on larger subs, will be in the control room, because when the captain says, okay, I want to flood this tank or that tank or the other, there physically will be a valve in that control room where a crewman can go, okay, yes, I'm going to open this valve and that's going to flood the tank. And obviously that has to be physically connected and water has to be flowing through it. And a violent shockwave could, of course, cause a breach in those pipes, whether by cracking it or by starting a weld or by popping a rivet, depending on the age of the sub and how it's put together. And obviously these pipes tend to be made of relatively soft malleable metals like brass or copper, so they will flex somewhat, but obviously a shockwave, especially if it bashes the pressure hull against the pipe or jerks a mounting about, could cause some kind of breach. The reason for the lack of a puddle is because the deck is not usually solid. It can be, but most decks, even if you've been on museum subs, the deck itself will tend to be a mesh grating, and there'll either be a storage space immediately underneath, so that's where the water will be going, or it might run down straight down to the bilges, or if you're in a larger sub, it might run down to a lower deck or something or other. So if you've tiled the control room, then yes, you could end up with a puddle, but even in a tiled control room, perhaps with lino, there will be a drain for water, most normally condensation, to percolate away without, turning the whole place into a slippy slide. And of course, for safety, because these pipes can fail in peacetime as well, or perhaps if you're doing a particularly deep dive and you can have various issues, you can also just have leaks through failures of maintenance or equipment, or you might want to shut off a particular area. So it's not just that there will be a control valve that opens and shuts it, there will be multiple cut-off valves along these pipes so that you can isolate various sections. So in the event that something starts to leak, it is plausible for someone to go, okay, it's that pipe, so we need to close that valve there and that valve there. That isolates that section of that pipe, and the water will, well, whatever's left in there will drain out, but very quickly the whole thing will come to a stop. And depending on the submarine, obviously how advanced it is and also how large it is, because larger subs allow for more redundancy, that may mean that you've just cut off water supply to wherever that pipe was going, but that's why you have multiple, let's say in the case of that pipe going to a ballast tank, that's why you have multiple ballast tanks. If it's for showering or cleaning or food, well, it doesn't really matter at that point. You can patch the pipe up later on. But if it is a ballast tank pipe, then, as I said, on larger and or more advanced subs, there will be ways to bypass that section and redivert water or air into that tank if you need to. But in either case, it's much, much better to cut off that section and worry about what that may or may not have cut off later on than to just let water pour into the sub. Farender Ritter asks, how would a young shipman with a peerage like Lord Blakeney, this is in the Master and Commander books, be perceived by his aristocratic peers after returning from a tour where he saw action and was wounded? Can you point to a real-life example that isn't Nelson? I can point to several examples. So the gentleman pictured here is Admiral Watkin Owen Pell. He is from minor gentry. Another example would be Admiral Sir Jaleel Brenton, who, as you might guess, was from slightly higher up the aristocratic food chain, and also later Admiral of the Fleet, Sir James Alexander Gordon, Scottish aristocracy. All three wounded in action. Pell and Gordon both lost legs, and Brenton was hit by grape shot in the body and had issues with it thereafter. There's plenty of other examples, but those three I thought were a pretty good grab bag, and also, in the case of the two that lost their legs, it's a very obvious one. Obviously, Blakeney in the Master and Commander film loses an arm. Now, if we're talking about the classic Nelsonian era Age of Sail, which is roughly speaking from where these three hail from, those kind of injuries would not be any kind of significant drawback on their social status and appearance. Of course, losing your leg is a little bit more of a difficult thing to deal with because there's a limited extent of prosthetics at the time, and Admiral Gordon at one point was said to have been very annoyed by the fact that because he lost his leg so far up, his prosthetic meant he couldn't kneel, which meant when he was received by the king, he was physically unable to kneel, and he thought this was very improper, but apparently no one else seemed to mind that much. But in any case, certainly by this period, those kinds of war wounds were seen by most as a badge of honour, because it was a case of, well, you had a duty to your country. And bear in mind, we're talking pre-World War One, so we're talking about a period where a lot, not all, obviously, there are always some nasty people in every social class, but an awful lot of certainly British aristocracy. I can't speak as much for foreign aristocracy because I don't know the ins and outs of it so much. But anyway, there was this sense of, you are gifted to be born higher than most, therefore you have a duty to serve your country and to lead, and to do your bit to defend the country and everything that it's provided for you. So if you go out and do that, and you come back with visible evidence of, hey, yeah, I was on the front line, I fought for my country, I fought for my men, I took wounds, and I survived by the grace of God, then most people are like, okay, cool, well done. It was a mark of having achieved something and, being on the forefront of something that actually mattered. And so that kind of thing, yeah, obviously, if anything, socially speaking, would be a bit of a leg up, no pun intended. About the only time that convention tended to fall apart, if it was some kind of very disfiguring injury. So if you got really badly burned, or a scatter of musket shot or canister across the face, and your face was really badly scarred up or had a lot of burn tissue, then it wasn't that the wound was dishonourable, but people didn't want to see that for whatever reason, and to a certain extent even that persists today with modern military veterans. For whatever reason, people are much more comfortable being around and applauding somebody who's had a limb blown off, and maybe has a prosthetic, maybe doesn't, than they are someone who's got third-degree burns across their entire face and has had to have partial reconstructive plastic surgery. And back in those days, when appearance was absolutely everything or near enough, then obviously that could be even more of an issue. Robert Henry Ilston asks, during the Age of Sail, are there accounts of Royal Navy ships supplementing their stores with fresh catches from the sea? Would a crew member familiar with deep-sea fishing have ever used their skills or knowledge to improve the ship's stores? Yes, actually, fishing seems to have been quite the unsung portion of an Age of Sail Royal Navy warship's life, at least when it could. Now, of course, they're not going to do permanent long-term fishing the way an actual fishing boat would, and there are some other restrictions. Most of the good fisheries tend to be in more coastal waters, occasionally out at sea near small islands or underwater outcrops where there's upwellings. But generally speaking, in the deeper oceans, while there are fish, there aren't vast numbers of them in a way that would make fishing particularly practicable. And obviously Royal Navy warships tend to go where they're needed rather than just where the good fish is. So there were limits on opportunities of when you could fish. And if you were near a coastline, it tended to be because you were either on a specific patrol looking for enemy vessels, or perhaps on blockade duty or something like that, which are obviously times when you don't necessarily want to be caught fishing. However, with that said, Royal Navy warships were known in the Age of Sail for carrying significant amounts of fishing equipment, such as it was during that period, including various forms of what we would today call line fishing, but also some are recorded as even actually having nets, which they could deploy if necessary. Now, of course, if you did have some crew aboard who had been fishermen in a previous career, they could lend their expertise as to where might be good spots for fishing and so forth. And it wasn't something, because it was obviously irregular, and to be honest, you'd have to catch an awful lot of fish to have a fair and even supplement to everybody's meals. It wasn't counted as part of your regular rations. It was just a case of, if you happen to catch some fish, well, great, you've made yourself and your messmates quite happy, but it's not necessarily going to translate across the entire crew. Obviously, if you have a really good catch, especially if you end up deploying a net or two, then yeah, that might actually be happy days for everybody. But again, it's a semi-irregular occurrence. So if you were perhaps on general patrol near a coastline, that might be an opportunity to do a little bit of fishing. But if you were on something a little bit more active, like blockade duty, or you're expecting an enemy vessel, you might do a little bit of line fishing over the side, because that kind of stuff is very easy to haul in very quickly if necessary. Or if you're on a long-term blockade, ships might be rotated out away from the blockade to do some gunnery practice, to do some sailing practice, to do all sorts of things. And of course, at that point, the captain might take the opportunity, if they happen to run into the right areas, to do a bit of fishing. But one of the other things that the Royal Navy would do in relation to fishing for fresh fish would be to just go and approach some of the local fishermen and go, hey, you've got fresh fish. Do you want to sell us some? And usually that would work out best for everybody because, hey, the fisherman gets to sell off an entire catch without having to go back into port. So he can go straight back to fishing and then obviously head back into port. So for a very minimal extension in his time at sea, he's making double the money. And for the Royal Navy, obviously, the crew get a whole bunch of fresh food without the rigmarole of finding the best fishing grounds and doing all the actual fishing themselves. And since the fisherman's going to be very happy with you, he might be more willing to let slip, what the state of the local ports are, where enemy warships might have gone, etc., etc. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, do we have any statistics or estimates on just how much more effect could have been achieved if the Mark 14 torpedo had actually worked as intended? And would this have significantly shortened the war in any significant ways? A yes and no on the statistics. So yes, we technically have those statistics available, in as much as every US submarine that went out on patrol during World War II had to when they came back, fill in essentially a report card. Obviously, it was filled in usually during the voyage, which detailed every torpedo expended, the type of torpedo, the time, the date, when, or where it was expended, roughly speaking. Obviously, they didn't know exactly, at what target, and what effect that torpedo had, which is how we know how many of them went so horribly wrong. However, to the best of my knowledge thus far, nobody has taken all of those cards and tabulated them in some kind of publicly available format where we can look and go, okay, well, prior to the fixes, here are all the individual torpedo expenditures which have been faulty. Now, obviously, some of that was done at the time. So, you get reports saying, well, this many ships were missed or this many torpedoes detonated prematurely or whatever. But in terms of a searchable table where you can maybe go, torpedoes that exclude torpedoes that hit, exclude torpedoes that just flat out missed, and then that leaves you with torpedoes that malfunctioned in some way. And then you can read off, okay, it was this time and date at that particular vessel, and did any of the others hit that vessel? So was the vessel, damaged or destroyed anyway? If not, then you can go, okay, well, this vessel potentially had 2 torpedoes prematurely detonate. It's a 10,000-ton freighter, 2 Mark 14s detonating actually on it probably would have sunk it, so we could say this would have been sunk had the Mark 14 functioned properly. This, Congo class, 1 torpedo was seen to pass underneath it, let's say. Okay, well, if that had worked, magnetic detonator worked, it probably wouldn't have been destroyed, but it certainly would have been sent back to repairs for several months, and then they wouldn't have been available for this and this mission, and that kind of stuff. As far as I'm aware, there isn't a publicly available database that tells us all that. Now, of course, anything like that is going to be incomplete to a certain degree, because submarines that went out on patrol and then didn't come back obviously weren't submitting report cards on what torpedoes they'd expended up until that point. But if someone did go through and do all of that work, we would at least have a good basis to go on for specific analysis of exactly what would have changed and exactly how many ships may or may not have been sunk. Of course, there is a certain element of these ships weren't hit and therefore everything played out the way that it did. If you did sink a bunch of those ships, what second order effects might that have had in terms of rerouting convoys, different escorts, operations possibly not occurring or being delayed, and therefore obviously things panning out slightly differently, but that's another matter entirely. And as far as would that have significantly shortened the war in any significant ways? Well, yes, generally speaking, from what information we do know and have easily to hand, yes, it would have definitely shortened the war to a certain extent. Although I'd hesitate to say shorten the war as in force Japan's surrender, because I don't think even if every Mark 14 had been working from the word go, that Japan would have surrendered any sooner than it did, given that they were quite literally prepared to fight to the death in a ground invasion. But it perhaps could have weakened the Japanese military's hold and position in various places, such that the US might have ended up in the position that it was, able to bombard Japan with mass B-29 raids and having occupied pretty much everything that wasn't the home islands that they were interested in, somewhat sooner and perhaps with fewer casualties. But working out exactly what those effects are would be a very, very difficult and detailed study, because not only would you be looking at rather more basic things like, if this warship is sunk 3 years earlier than historical, what other ships would be called in to replace it, and therefore which ones of those would be lost, what operations did those ships take part in which they now couldn't, so which operations would have to be cancelled or moved around. That's complicated enough, but it's actually relatively less complicated than looking at the various merchant ships, because if you say, okay, well, in 1942, let's say Japan loses 24 oil tankers that it historically doesn't. Does Japan build more oil tankers? What do they do with the rest of their oil tankers? Where is that oil going? And all the voyages that those oil tankers subsequently made now obviously don't happen. And what's the cumulative effect of all that? That's actually a far, far more complicated thing to work out, at least in my mind, than this destroyer was sunk, therefore it's not going to show up at the next battle where it got sunk anyway, but might obviously therefore weaken the Japanese formation overall by not being there. John McCarthy asks, during his talk at the conference aboard HMS Belfast, Professor Lambert said that in the 1890s the Royal Sovereign class were forced to have side-by-side funnels due to the boiler design used. What were the features of the boilers that mandated this choice? So it was a combination of a couple of different things, one of which was that at this point the Royal Navy was still using fire tube boilers. So if you recall, this is an older style of boiler where you pass hot gases through the tubes and that heats a large mass of water around the tubes, a little bit like a kettle, just with a lot more tubing. The more modern way of doing things, which was just up and coming in that time period, was water tube boilers, which is where you pass the water through the tubing and you heat the air around it, and that generates the steam. So one of the advantages, but there's lots of different advantages I covered in my boilers video a while back, but one of the big advantages is that you can make a water tube boiler considerably smaller and easier to fit, and it weighs less compared to a fire tube boiler. And on top of that, there was also a period pretty much starting with the Victoria class going through, including the Royal Sovereigns here. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be where it ends with the Majestics and Renown afterwards. It seems to be purely the fact that they're using fire tube boilers. But certainly up until and including the Royal Sovereigns, there was this idea of putting some of the magazines on the centre line between the boiler rooms. Basically, depending on exactly which class we're talking about, either the propellant magazines for the main guns or the secondary magazines. The idea essentially being that this would keep them as far away as possible from incoming shell fire. Of course, mines and torpedoes, while they were around at this point, weren't really being designed for as a major threat. And between those two factors of having these gigantic fire tube boilers and this magazine in the middle, those boilers had to then be placed relatively far out on either side, and that meant that the amount of trunking that you would need in the upper bits of the ship, because obviously the funnels and the trunking that supplies them, the trunking would have to come up from the boilers, and because of that central magazine, they have to go up considerably far into the ship before then cutting in at a disfavourable angle, and then up again if you wanted a centerline funnel. And so it just made more sense to trunk several boilers fore and aft together and have them come up off-centre, and thus you get these side-by-side funnels instead. Now, what appears to be the case with the Majestics and Renown is that they got rid of the centerline magazine idea, but still left with the fire tube boilers. It was just, again, easier to trunk funnels together fore and aft. So the difference between what you see on Royal Sovereign and what you see on the Majestics and Renown, that's the pre-dreadnaught Renown, is that on the latter ships, while they do still have those side-by-side funnels, they're basically literally right next to each other because that gap in the middle has gone away. And then you get to the canopuses and subsequent British pre-dreadnoughts, where they've gone over to water tube boilers, and then they're back to the fore and aft layout that they had before. And obviously, another part of it is, in these ships, all these ships we just mentioned, there was a requirement for more boilers because they wanted to go a bit faster than they had been going before, and the ships were bigger, and so they needed more power anyway. F-19A Ghost Rider asks, I've read that Winston Churchill at one point considered sending Force Z to Hawaii to join with the weakened US Pacific Fleet in the immediate aftermath of the start of the Pacific War, and of course before Force Z was actually destroyed on December the 10th. Hypothetically, if somehow Prince of Wales and Repulse had survived the initial operations in Malaya with minimal to no damage and actually made the journey to Hawaii, would the resources of the US Pacific Fleet have been able to logistically support them? I mean in the sense of repairs and some spare parts, and in particular replacement ammunition. Would the 14-inch shells in particular of the disabled US battle line have been usable by Prince of Wales's main battery? Technically speaking, the 14-inch shells from the US battleships would be able to physically fit in Prince of Wales's guns, but I wouldn't want to do so because the US shells have a completely different point of balance. They have a different amount of explosive in them, so that's going to change things. They're a completely different length. They're somewhat shorter, which is why they'll fit in the hoists and everything. But, of course, again, being shorter, different point of balance, and they're also a little bit lighter. So, different balance, different length, different flight characteristics, different weight. Prince of Wales's gunnery control tables aren't going to know what to make of them. You'd have to create an entirely new profile, assuming they'd even stay stable in flight, because the muzzle velocities are different as well. So, yeah, you could fire them, but I think they would only really be useful in an absolute point-blank engagement. Otherwise, they just go wildly off into the blue yonder. However, it's not all bad, because while, 40mm pom-pom ammo, 5.25-inch and 4-inch anti-aircraft ammunition, and British 14-inch shells and 15-inch shells for Repulse are not exactly in widespread supply at Pearl Harbor, the simple fact of the matter is that supplying those various spare parts wouldn't be too much of a problem for the Allies. Because, well, you look at, say, Warspite. Warspite went to Bremerton, Puget Sound, and she was there when the Pearl Harbor attack happened, and she was there for repairs. Now, of course, the Americans weren't going to fabricate British spare parts and equipment while she was there, and so the British shipped out everything up to and including refreshed 15-inch guns over the Atlantic, which then got taken overland for the most part through the States. I think some of it went round the continental United States by ship as well, and all fetched up in Puget Sound, where it was all stuck onto Warspite. So if Prince of Wales and Repulse show up in Pearl Harbor, the US never particularly had a problem keeping Pearl Harbor supplied from the continental United States, so as long as the Royal Navy is shipping spare parts and components across from Britain to the United States, it's not going to be very difficult for the US to just include those in shipments over to Pearl Harbor to keep Prince of Wales and Repulse, and presumably their escorts, in operational running condition. The biggest issue, to be honest, is just going to be fuel. More specifically, fuel on tankers and tankers that can do refueling, which was a problem for the US as well. Bear in mind, yes, having Prince of Wales and Repulse available and there as fast capital ship escorts for their carriers is going to be exactly what the US Navy wants from a doctrinal perspective. But when you look at situations like Coral Sea and so forth, it's very clear that even when they were operating, quote-unquote, just with carriers and a handful of cruisers, the US Navy's logistics arm for refueling everybody was stretched to the absolute limit. And that's one of several reasons why the North Carolina did its first operation in the Atlantic. Yes, it was over into the Pacific by mid-1942 once the US logistical situation had improved somewhat, but we're talking about that first half of 1942 when the logistics are pretty dire. With all that said, however, at the beginning of 1942, because of the various issues North Carolina and Washington had had working up, they weren't quite considered ready in December 41, January 42 for service, certainly not on long-distance missions into the Pacific, whereas possibly, if Prince of Wales and Repulse had rocked up and gone, hey, we are here, we are ready, we can help, potentially the US might have scraped the barrel somewhere and found an extra tanker or two, because it's a situation that's definitely worth remedying, as opposed to, shall we transit this ship that's still got some potentially dodgy issues with its moving around at top speed, or do we keep it where it might be a bit more useful in the Atlantic, which is the situation they had with the North Carolinas at the start of 42. Scott Jennings asks, in response to my question last month, you mentioned that any attempt to use an Abdiel-class minelayer as a smuggling vessel or blockade runner would have to contend with both the large crew requirement and the fact that the vessel would most likely be disarmed. As a follow-up to that, what would be the absolute minimum crew complement needed to keep an Abdiel-class running, assuming that you didn't need any gun crews? And in more general terms, roughly what percentage of a typical steam and steel warship's crew would you need as a skeleton crew to keep the thing operational, assuming you aren't planning to take it into combat? Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rule about percentages of essentially caretaker crews as long as you want to keep a ship operational, because even if you're not planning on taking it into combat, guns still need to be cleaned, checked, traversed, etc., etc. Obviously, you need to keep boilers fired, to keep switching through the boilers, both to keep the generators ticking over so you actually have power, and also so that the ship isn't completely cold and dead. And there's all sorts of other things to do, bilges to check, leaks to deal with if they arise. Obviously, there's got to be command and leadership positions, and the mess crew to serve, the galley crew to serve everybody food, and things like this. And all of that is going to vary quite considerably depending on the kind of ship. So a ship with an awful lot of boilers and machinery, so a high power, high speed ship, might need more crew in its engineering department, but a very large ship, even if it's relatively slow, will have so many guns that a good chunk of those gunnery crews are going to be on board and needed. And at this point, the square cube law works against you, because not only are we talking about considerably more space, but also larger and more complex systems. So whereas perhaps on a destroyer, even if you've got lots of different types of guns, say 20mm, 40mm, and your main guns, a relatively small gunnery crew, maybe half a dozen guys, can work their way through pretty much the ship's entire armament relatively quickly. Not only would half a dozen people not be enough for a single gun turret on, say, a twin or triple turret battleship, but the amount of time it would take them to deal with just the main armament, let alone all the secondaries and the AA armament, you're going to need an awful lot more people and probably proportionally a higher amount of crew. So there might be percentages for destroyers, percentages for cruisers, percentages for subs, percentages for battleships, assuming we're talking about keeping these things operational as in a running condition, as opposed to caretaker crews in reserve and stuff like that. But yeah, so essentially I can't give you a completely straight answer for that element. However, with the Abdiels, they've got roughly 240 to 245 men on board at the start of wartime operations. Later on, they'll have a few more as they add anti-aircraft guns. But if you eliminate the 4 twin 4-inch guns and the light anti-aircraft guns, you're immediately eliminating somewhere around about 100 to 150 men, depending on if you're directly counting the people operating the guns, or you're including everyone who's passing ammunition up from the magazines and everyone who's on board because you have to take care of that many men, like galley staff and officers to lead them and so on and so forth. So let's say you can cut the crew down to roughly 100 just by taking out all the armament and all the people associated with that element of the crew. Now, in theory, you're going to need a navigation officer, a captain, a first officer, someone to do signals, and someone to operate the helm. So you're going to need at least 5 people on the bridge, double that up at least. I mean, if you're going to do short-term blockade running missions, etc., as opposed to prolonged at-sea missions, you can probably get away with a 2-shift pattern, i.e. 2 crews, rather than needing 3 crews on 3 shifts or whatever. So you're going to need at least 10, probably close to 15 people in various positions associated with the bridge and command. A similar number of people to actually keep everybody fed and watered. So we're already up to 30. And that's because you've got 4 boilers and 2 turbines with the Abdiel. So even assuming that you're literally just keeping it to people to actually get the ship to go where you want it to go, and people to run the engines so that it can go where the command staff want it to go, and the people to feed them, you're going to be looking at least 15 to 20 people per shift on the engines, and probably maybe even slightly more than that, because that's just the number you need to keep an eye on things, and that's not including ancillary systems like power generation. So let's say you need a minimum of 25 to 30 people overall. So looking at the boilers, the turbines, keeping charge of everything, and running the generators, etc., and checking the ship end to end and all this kind of stuff that the engineering department does. At which point, double that up, because obviously you need 2 sets of people to a minimum to run the ship, so that's 60 plus your other 30, 90. Throw in a few ancillaries and spares in case someone gets hurt. So you're looking probably around about a minimum crew of 100. And at that point, you're going to be running either 6 hours on, 6 hours off, or 12 hours on, 12 hours off. It's not a particularly long-term sustainable setup, but you could run a ship like the Abdiel on around about 100 people, I would say, as long as you weren't going to be out at sea for weeks and weeks and weeks on end. Glenn Ricafrente asks, I asked this question of the folks at the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast, and I thought I'd get your take on it. What was more impressive, the way the US Navy rolled back the Japanese with overwhelming force later in the war, or the way the Japanese conquered huge swathes of Southeast Asia and the South and Central Pacific in the first place during the first half year of the war with a much lesser preponderance of force? I think actually both of those things are very impressive, but impressive in such different ways that I'm not sure a direct comparison holds up. Yes, they are both involving conquering large sections of the South and Central Pacific, just obviously going in opposite directions. But for the Japanese, they're doing it against a very hard timer. They're doing it with essentially practically untested battle tactics in the real world environment. They're doing it on a bit of a shoestring in terms of supplies and so forth, because one of their biggest issues with why they're on a timer is the lack of oil. If they don't capture the Dutch East Indies by a certain point, they are going to be in a lot of trouble. And they're operating in a relatively intelligence-poor environment, both because they haven't had a huge amount of success at cracking Allied codes, and also simply because they don't know what the exact capabilities of a lot of Allied equipment is, or even where that equipment is. Now, obviously, the Allies have their own handicaps in form of ABDA command not being particularly effective, the whole response being fairly uncoordinated, the Mark 14 not working, etc., 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 etc. The Allies are, to a certain extent, as much, if not more, in the dark about how the Japanese equipment operates as the Japanese are about Allied equipment. So the fact the Japanese managed to pull off the amount of success that they do before everything rolls up short for them at Midway is hugely impressive. But when you look at the US coming back the other way later on, they have the resources, they have the intelligence, they have the knowledge of how most of the Japanese technology works. So you could say, well, that sounds less impressive then, because they had all these advantages. And of course, they have the huge numbers advantage. However, the flip side is, of course, the Japanese now know to a greater degree how American equipment works. The Japanese have prepared for this. They have the defender's advantage, and they've dug in, which the Japanese usually didn't have to face on their way out in 42. And while, yes, the US has this massive numbers advantage, there is a reason they have that numbers advantage. And the sheer complexity of the logistical effort to build, service, maintain, train the crews for, and then crew all these ships, and then coordinate them all in a fashion that actually resembles an organized, coherent fleet and not a random mass of several hundred ships trying desperately to find their way westwards, is in and of itself a hugely impressive issue. They always say, the professional study logistics, but it is true to a greater or lesser extent. Anyone who's tried to organize any large crowd of anyone, of any number of people, will know just how difficult that is. And to organize tens or hundreds of thousands of people, depending on the size of the fleet and whether you count the troops being taken to the landings as elements of the fleet or just self-loading cargo. But anyway, to manage that many people and that many ships, and to get them under hostile fire to the place you need them to go and to do their jobs properly with, relatively speaking, minimal losses, that is a feat that a lot of nations probably couldn't pull off. There's relatively few nations in history who have been able to both build a very large fleet and then crew, sustain, and operate it properly. And that, especially on the scale they did in the Pacific, is massively impressive because the Russians had a fairly large fleet at the start of the 20th century. Their whole operational logistics training element, though, not really there so much. And you can cite numerous other examples as well. But essentially, the kind of operation that the US pulled off, probably throughout history, in terms of matching both scale of fleet in absolute terms and scale of fleet relative to the nation and the time period, it's probably only really matched by two other powers, which would be Britain at the height of its power in the 19th century, early 20th century, and probably Rome at the height of its power in antiquity. In between that, some element of what they did is missing. So that is a very impressive achievement. But as you can probably tell, they're achievements in completely different fields of naval accomplishments. So saying which is the most impressive... Now, obviously, opinions may vary, but to me, it's almost like what's more impressive, the guy who runs 100 meters in 9 seconds or the guy who runs a marathon in a little bit over 2 hours. Both incredibly impressive, neither strictly comparable, although they both do involve running. Jim Smitty asks, in the past, you've mentioned how you believe the county-class cruisers of the Royal Navy were designed for, but not with, an armour belt. My question is, what if the Germans had done basically the same thing for the Deutschland-class Panzerschiff, i.e. have an armoured box over the magazines but basically nothing for the rest of the belt, then bring them in for a refit in the late 30s and give them a belt that was capable of rejecting 8-inch shells at standard battle ranges? How would such refits affect how the Allies take on raiders like Graf Spee at the River Plate if it had armour that could reject Exeter's main guns at standard battle ranges? Would this force someone like Harwood to go, drive me closer, I want to hit them with my sword? I think a lot of it would depend on what exactly the Germans defined as standard battle range, because obviously standard battle range for heavy cruisers, as in the range they generally open in engagement, would be in the high teens and low 20s of thousands of yards, depending on the circumstances and the ships in question. So 18 to 22,000 yards or so. Now, of course, the Deutschland's 11-inch guns can hit rather further than that and still punch through quite heavy armour. So if we say took roughly 18,000 yards or so as the lower boundary, that would suggest that the Deutschlands would need about 4.5 inches of armour. But of course, that would mean that it would only take a heavy cruiser, which of course the heavy cruisers are faster than the Deutschlands, closing the range by just a little bit down to 16,000 yards, and now they can penetrate that belt. And actually the penetration of the British 8-inch does start to increase rather dramatically as you close down the ranges. So, for example, if you wanted to be safe down to 14,000 yards, you'd need a 6-inch belt, which would be almost half again as heavy as the 4.5-inch belt. You'd need to be safe at a little bit beyond 18,000 yards. And then as you get closer to 12,000, 10,000, etc., it starts to become a little bit absurd. And then, of course, you also have to take into account the fact that each of the three Deutschlands had a somewhat different armour scheme to its predecessor. But nonetheless, if we, let's say, the Germans slap a 5-inch belt on, so that'll give a reasonable amount of protection, at least out at the ranges that the Deutschlands want to fight. The slightly surprising thing is that it actually wouldn't have made a huge difference to the Battle of the River Plate. I mean, yes, there might have been a bit more of a drive to press a little bit closer, but if you actually look at the battle map for River Plate, Exeter got well within the necessary range to punch through, obviously, Graf Spee's actual armour belt, which he succeeded in doing at the battle, but also the range was more than close enough to punch through even this hypothetical enhanced armour belt, Exeter managing to close the range down to around 10,000 yards at one point. And given that Harwood's force was trying to get close enough to use its torpedoes, it's not exactly surprising they managed to get that close. So oddly enough, having this increased armour, although it theoretically makes the Deutschlands far more survivable, specifically at River Plate, really wouldn't have done all that much for Graf Spee, which I think is a bit of a salutary lesson in why you need to be at least within shouting distance of your opponent's top speed, because otherwise, no matter what you design your armour belt for within reasonable limits, they can just close you down to a point where that's no longer really very useful to you. Joao Rita asks, Steam, while having obvious advantages, brought about the massive logistical problem that was the need to have so many thousands of tons of coal at the ready all across the world. While having this available in home waters would be more or less easy to do, how much of a headache was it to expand stations far from home, especially in areas where there was no local coal? It was actually very difficult. Now, there were some ways in which you could say it was relatively easy, because the increase in later in the 19th century things like the production of electricity, as well as just general heating for homes and various other neat reasons and needs for which you would use coal, meant that there was a fairly healthy civilian coal industry, as in transporting coal from more industrialized areas to various far-flung corners of the world. So in theory, if a nation wanted to set up an overseas coaling base, then they would obviously need to find either land to buy or lease or actively control to create the coal pile, and then just go, okay, we're going to charter a bunch of colliers to bring us a bunch of coal, hire some local labour to move the coal from the dock to wherever it is we're going to store it, and now we have a coal pile. However, there are some rather considerable issues with this if you want to do it as a naval thing. Firstly, coal can't just sit out in the open forever and a day. It's relatively stable, but especially if you're talking about the places where most of these coaling stations would have to be set up, which tend to be in areas with, shall we say, environmental extremes, either of the more tropical or the more Arctic style bent, then coal can and will degrade over time. So there has to be a certain amount of turnover of the coal to keep it fresh. So ships coming in, using the coal, that depletes the stockpile, therefore you renew the stockpile, the older coal gets used up first, etc., etc. And that means, of course, you then have to have ships regularly using that stockpile. Now, the problem you face as a given navy is your navy visiting this area sufficiently often with sufficiently large ships to actually work that coal pile over and justify the expense of running the whole thing? If not, that's a problem. Now, of course, you could say, well, establish the coal stockpile and sell it to whoever shows up and maybe keep a reserve for your navy. Okay, fine, you can act as a commercial coal dealer, but then the thing is, what's to stop ships just coaling up in other areas where they perhaps can do it cheaper? Because if you are a navy of limited size, then to establish your specific coal pile in your specific area is going to be naturally off the route of the regular collier runs, so they're going to charge a premium. So your coal is going to cost a premium. So unless you want to sell it at a loss, people will just go, well, their coal costs so much per ton, but if we go, 2 days sailing up the coast, or we coal a day earlier as we're sailing along the coast, that coal is a third cheaper. And where is that coal most certainly going to be? In a British-controlled port, because, of course, Britain has the largest merchant fleet, it has the largest navy, it has, therefore, the largest demand for coal, it owns an awful lot of coaling stations, or ports that could potentially be coaling stations, and therefore it's set up regular runs, obviously using economies of scale, to build up large stockpiles of coal, which are regularly getting turned over, and therefore they can afford to essentially outcompete almost everyone who doesn't have access to local coal. And what this essentially adds up to is that only other nations with large overseas empires and large overseas navies that needed to then go and service those empires realistically could maintain significant coal networks. So essentially, when you left your home waters as a European ship or an American ship or something like that, if you were going to recoal overseas, it meant most likely you were visiting a British-controlled port, or possibly you were visiting a French-controlled port, or possibly you were visiting the port of a neutral third party who happened to have local coal deposits, and therefore, obviously, it was much cheaper to have coal at that port than it would be to ship it internationally to an area that didn't have ready access to coal. Outside of that, the only other coal depots that you tended to find for various other navies, German, Spanish, etc., tended to be essentially state-controlled naval stockpiles, which were established and run basically at a loss, so as to ensure that that navy had some kind of coal access in a specific area which was in their long-term strategic interest, like, say, Cuba for the Spanish before the Spanish-American War, or later on at Tsingtao for the Germans in the run-up to World War I. And on top of that, there was a little bit of a snowball effect, because for a lot of nations, they would just go, okay, well, specifically the Treasury departments thereof, they just go, okay, well, why should we pay to run our own little coaling station at a loss over there in some far-flung area when the British are running a coaling station, half a day sailing away, and it's cheaper for us to buy the coal from them by a fairly long way than it is for us to establish our own coal stockpile just up the coast. So just refuel from them. I mean, it's not like we're going to be fighting the British anytime soon, is it? And of course, then more demand on the British coal ports meant that the British had even greater economies of scale, and the whole thing became even cheaper, and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, of course, that didn't mean that Britain had the only coal ports, but it meant for a good portion of the world they did have the only coal ports, and or had the only significant size coal ports. And they could, of course, then exert diplomatic and financial pressure on the neutral ports and coaling stations to also not sell coal to people they were particularly displeased with, which is why, for example, the Russians had so many issues coaling, trying to get round to eventually the Battle of Tsushima. And for the US with the Great White Fleet, it was one of their big takeaway lessons, because in the aftermath of it, the US Navy essentially went, yes, great, fantastic. We showed off our power. We went around the world. This is all good, except we're trying to establish ourselves as a global power. And we basically did almost all of that on the back of the British coal station network. So if we do want to establish ourselves as a global power, we either have to acknowledge we're on a second tier well below Britain and always count out to them, otherwise we can't sail anywhere because we won't be able to get the coal, or we have to go through a massive amount of expense to start shipping coal ourselves to various overseas stations. And that's why in the run-up to World War I, and obviously not so much after World War I as people start to switch over to oil, but especially before World War I, you tend to see various nations who either are acting directly in opposition to British interests, like the Germans, or who want to be essentially fuel independent from British political whims, like the Americans, starting to establish, despite the cost, their own coaling stations across the world. GFDX asks, as far as I'm aware, after the loss of HMS Courageous to U-29 in 1939, all aircraft carriers were taken off convoy duty due to the apparent risk. Yet later on there was a massive need for and massive success with escort carriers. Was the reason for the success simply their size, or were there better tactics developed later on? Or does the difference lie elsewhere? There were quite a number of factors in play that distinguish the loss of Courageous from the later success of escort carriers. On the face of it, it might seem a bit paradoxical because, of course, Courageous was significantly faster than escort carriers and carried considerably more aircraft than the average escort carrier, or at least it could do. But there were developments in tactics, and there were also, obviously, crucially, developments in technology on both sides. However, that, while it would contribute somewhat, I think is not the largest factor. The two largest factors are escort size and mission, when you compare the two. So with Courageous, although she was technically defending convoys, she wasn't assigned to a convoy. She was on an independent sub-hunting mission, the way that actually some hunter-killer groups would later be established towards the end of World War II. But being on a sub-hunting mission, that meant that she was pretty much the only major target if a U-boat happened to come across her. And that made her obviously much more likely to be attacked, as opposed to if you have an escort carrier working with a convoy, she is one of many large ships, and ultimately, while an escort carrier does pose a threat, if she's in one portion of a convoy, the statistical odds of a U-boat that discovers the convoy seeing and targeting the escort carrier first are relatively minimal, because statistically they're much more likely to be closer to, and therefore want to immediately target, some of the merchant ships. Whereas obviously, as we just said, if Courageous is the only big ship there when the U-boat stumbles across her formation, well, she's the one that's going to be attacked. Now, you might think, hang on a minute, doesn't that track for the escort carriers that later form the hunter-killer groups? They're slower, they would also be the biggest ship in their hunter-killer group, so they should be the primary targets of the U-boats, and therefore there should have been significant losses amongst them. Well, this is where the escort size comes around. Now, irrespective of the advances in sonar and anti-submarine tactics and hedgehog launchers versus depth charges and all of that, the simple fact was that if you have an escort carrier operating with a convoy is going to have at least half a dozen escorts, usually considerably more if an escort carrier has been allocated to it. And if it's off on a hunter-killer group, again, it's going to have a fair number of escorts. Courageous sailed with 4 destroyers. So if you sent an escort carrier out there with just 4 escorts, whether it be in a hunter-killer group or in a convoy escort, that would already be considered considerably under strength. And in some ways is reflective of both, the relative early nature of sonar-based anti-submarine tactics at the beginning of World War II, but also just the fact the Royal Navy's destroyers were being pulled left, right, and centre in 1939. But when it came to when she was stalked by the U-boat that sank her, she didn't even have that. She just had 2 destroyers, because two of her escorts had been sent off to help a merchant ship that had been attacked earlier by a U-boat. So at that point, you have a fleet carrier with just 2 destroyers as escort wandering around the ocean. There is no way those destroyers could form anything like an effective escort screen, and that allowed the submarine to get close enough. Whereas whether you're either looking at the convoy escorting escort carrier or an escort carrier on its own doing a hunter-killer mission, they always have multiple escorts, whether they be frigates or destroyer escorts or full destroyers or whatever, but they always have multiple escorts there specifically to form a defensive ring around them and leave enough spare to prosecute submarines that have been sighted. And that was probably the single largest problem for poor old Courageous. If she'd sortied with a half flotilla of destroyers, so let's say half a dozen or so, and they'd stuck with her, there's a reasonable chance that U-29 would have been detected and driven off. But 2 destroyers is no escort for a carrier facing submarines in that kind of environment. Brian Nicholas asks, less a question, more of a request. Is there a way we could purchase a 3D print of HMS Thunderchild, preferably in either 1:350 or 1:700, or even 1:200 for those of us older modelers whose eyesight isn't what it used to be? I particularly enjoy building and painting up old ironclads and pre-dreadnaughts, and the scale. I mention these scales because even at 1:350, a scale ship of that era will be a relatively small model. So I have been actually working on that, and as some of you who hopefully are listening who came to the Naval History Conference on HMS Belfast will have seen, I do actually have some prototypes of 3D printed versions of HMS Thunderchild, which I've been making. However, essentially, I've run into a little bit of a problem. And it's not to do with actually having the file itself, the STL. The STL has actually been made for me by an exceptionally wonderful subscriber. No, the problem I have is what medium to print it in. Because I have a large filament 3D printer, an H2C, And actually, when you do it on extremely fine settings, which I have done, as I say, people have seen it, it prints the models actually at a really, really good detail. There's occasionally a very, very small amount of layer lining present here and there, but it's only in small patches. And once you've put a decent coat of primer on it, that's all going to disappear. We're not talking about the old school stuff where you'd see every single layer line. And it is very highly detailed, and it's really, really nice. The problem with that is that, well, two things. Firstly, FDM printing doesn't tend to lend itself to the more delicate portions like the masts and so forth very well. And also, as you can see here from this 3D rendering, you have the kind of boat deck / hurricane deck. It's essentially a very thin deck with lots of little supports and small guns underneath it, the sort of 47mm, etc. guns. Now, when I print, and I printed at 1:700 and 1:350 and an intermediate stage, I'm not entirely sure at what scale it is, but it's a little bit more handleable. Now, the problem there is that my FDM printer can print all of that detail very nicely, but it has to put in a ton of supports. And of course, those little supports are tucked in underneath the boat deck and above and sort of intermingled with all the little pillars. And getting those out is a bit of a pain. And while it can be done, you do have to take a fair bit of time. You do have to be very careful because you can end up knocking out the actual, the ship's support pillars that support the boat deck. Now, theoretically, you could replace those fairly easily, but it is a little bit annoying. The other thing is the little guns that are in there, the anti-torpedo boat guns. They can very often either get not bound up in, but accidentally taken out with the supports as you're trying to get the little supports out. So that's not ideal. Now, there is a solution to those smaller details, and that is, of course, simply to print the hull as an FDM print, and then print the smaller details, like the gun barrels, etc., as resin prints, because I do also have a resin printer. And I have actually done that for one particular combination, and it does work, especially if I was going to batch produce these. Obviously, my build plates currently have a build plate for one model, whereas if I was going to, say, sell them in a limited production run, then I would print, maybe 100 6-inch gun barrels, and if a few of them fail, oh well, such is life. I've still got plenty to, make sure that each ship model has its requisite dozen guns. I have also tried printing the whole thing on FDM, and on FDM, it kind of works when you do it at 1:350 or larger scale, because of course everything becomes somewhat bigger. But then you also run into the flip side of that, which is that FDM prints take longer the more stuff is on the print tray. So if I print let's say 1:400 scale Thunderchild, and I print a 1:350 and I print a 1:200, it takes exponentially longer to print the 1:200, and you'd probably only be able to print one at a time. Whereas if I do it via a resin printer, the resin printer doesn't care how much stuff you've put on the build plate, it only cares how many layers there are. So, and therefore what's the height of the overall print. So if you print a set of models that have, say, 100 layers or 500 layers, it doesn't matter if you're printing one mast that's 500 layers tall, or you're printing 3 hulls, 6 turrets, and 2 masts that are 500 layers tall. It's going to print in exactly the same amount of time on a resin printer as on an FDM. But then obviously with the resin printer, you've got more chance of failure, at least with my experience with 3D printers. And you then also have to go through the process of washing it down, curing it, etc., etc. You have to remove the supports as well. Although I would say, because of the sort of bottom-up nature of FDM printing versus the, in some ways, almost top-down nature of resin printing, the nature of the supports you need for this particular model is slightly easier to do in resin. And then, of course, you have the fact that, generally speaking, resin printers have a smaller build area than FDM printers. So at the moment, I could print 1 to 700 Thunderchilds very easily on my resin printer, but the poor thing ends up only being about 4, maybe, about 4 and a bit inches long. Whereas if I print a large-scale 1 to 350, which is what most people will have seen at the Belfast conference, I have to use the FDM printer for that, with maybe some resin-printed smaller parts. Now, I could square that circle and get a Jupiter 2, which is coming out soon, I think, or is out at this point, who knows. And that would give me a resin printer that could, in theory, at least print a 1 to 350 Thunderchild in resin, which would be quite fun. But then obviously I have to take a decision of, do I want to invest in that and all the necessary specific resin cartridges that it needs, etc., etc., and potentially get a second set of washing and curing stations to deal with resin prints that big, because my current washing and curing station for resin prints I don't think would fit a 1 to 350 hull. And then finally, on top of all that, of course, you could argue, well, the other solution is just to have the STLs up for sale, so people can buy the STLs and print them themselves, and they can worry about scale and all of these problems themselves, which is great. And yes, in theory, that could work to a certain degree. However, one, it doesn't solve the problem for people who don't have 3D printers. And second, sooner rather than later, I'm pretty sure some unscrupulous individual will stumble across the STL, probably pay for it, download it, and then just republish it, rehost it elsewhere, and people will essentially be able to pirate it, at which point, great. So these are the dilemmas that I face. I do want to bring a 3D print of HMS Thunderchild to people who want one. I just have to establish, essentially, what kind of size, what scale people want, what kind of material people want, what they would be happy with in terms of how much of the support structure do you want me to leave on there, because of course if I take off the support structures, then anything I damage is my problem, and I'm sending you a somewhat then possibly mildly broken product, versus if I send it to you with the vast majority of the support still on there, well, it's down to you. If you break it, that's your problem, but it adds work to you. So all of these questions, I think, have to be resolved. Maybe I'll put it up to some kind of poll or survey or something like that. Or maybe I could do some kind of pre-order thing where people can say this is what I would like, and then once they've all put their pre-orders down, and I have a temporary window where I say I can sustain up to this many in this pre-order Windows production batch, and then once I know what that is, then I can close it down and say, okay, right, you guys have ordered this, you'll get it, it'll take you this amount of time because I've got to produce the things. Or maybe someone out there has a 3D printer farm and a lot more experience producing things in 3D print en masse than I do, and would like to get in touch. That might solve the problem as well. Let me know. Sapper Ninja asks, what would be some fascinating examples of nearly battles where forces came very close to engaging but missed each other? We've talked in the past about the Indian Ocean raid and potentially the Jutland night action that never quite was, at least between capital ships, but what are maybe some lesser-known examples, especially where they could have had some serious historical impact? Well, one that's somewhat lesser known, more widely, perhaps more commonly known to people in this channel, because I've talked about it off and on occasionally, would be the near night action between Hood and Prince of Wales and Bismarck and Prince Eugen, which was in fact the original plan, as opposed to the historic Battle of Denmark Strait, which happened, roughly speaking, 12 hours afterwards. The idea was for Hood, Prince of Wales, their destroyers, and Norfolk and Suffolk to dive in at night using radar, get up close and hammer the Germans in a night action. The whole thing went to pot simply because Suffolk lost radar contact at the last possible moment and wasn't able to provide the Hood and Prince of Wales with the final vectors in so that they could move in and strike, which was a bit unfortunate because, who knows how that could have ended up. but simply the fact of potentially having destroyers involved. Historically, they did have to break off a little bit early because of weather, but potentially having them involved, or at the very least having everything happen at a very, very close range, with Norfolk and Suffolk dropping in as well, given that what we know the heavy cruisers that were present at Bismarck's final action were able to do to her, could very well have meant that Denmark Strait was just a flat-out Royal Navy victory. Then you have Nelson sneaking through the Spanish fleet that he unintentionally finds himself in the middle of in the fog while he's leaving the Mediterranean. Now, of course, that would have been a very one-sided battle if the Spanish had realised he'd been there. You'd got an entire Spanish Age of Sail fleet versus one frigate. But if the Spanish had killed or captured Nelson at that point, that could have had huge knock-on impacts for the continuation of the war at sea in the Napoleonic Wars. I'm not to say that it would completely collapse the British efforts, but I mean, Nelson was pretty critical in a good number of campaigns and victories, so who takes over instead of him, and how would they conduct things differently? And I guess to round out an example, 3 examples, again being in World War II, there is some indication that during the Battle of Cape Matapan, the wider action, that is, as opposed to just the execution of Pola and her accompanying, well, would-be rescuers, there is some indication that the British light cruisers actually spotted what, at least elements of the main Italian fleet, and could potentially have moved to engage them at night with radar-guided torpedoes and guns, but for various reasons didn't move to investigate that particular contact. If they had done, then that could have been a very interesting fight, and of course, considering that you have an already damaged Vittorio Veneto in there, that could have had some rather interesting knock-on impacts for the rest of the Mediterranean campaign. Bert Clothier asks, I'm just wading into Robert Massey's tome Castles of Steel, and 2 questions have popped out. Unless I missed it in searching the videos on your channel so far, we don't seem to have an Admiral special on Jellicoe. And secondly, could you explain the positions and roles of the board of the Admiralty at the time? We see talk of the First Lord of the Admiralty, the First Sea Lord, and the board, etc., etc. So how does it work? So I absolutely do want to do a video series on Jellicoe. However, as I'm sure some of you are probably throwing tomatoes at the screen right now, I already have quite a number of multi-part series going. We've got the Admiral Cunningham one I need to pick up fairly soon. We've got the anti-slavery patrols. We've got USS Enterprise, British naval exercises, the American Pacific submarine campaign, the Japanese Pacific submarine campaign, and Schnellboot, or Schnellbooter. Those are, just off the top of my head, the series that I've started that I can remember offhand that I haven't actually concluded. Now, to be fair, some of that is various health issues that have been going on in the background that you don't really get a look into from this side of the channel, because I just tend to keep them private, and partly it's because I admit, several of those started out as me just planning them to be kind of an hour, maybe an hour and a half standalone video, and it just grew to the point where I did one video and went, there's no way I'm covering the whole thing. I'm going to have to cut it off here at this point, and then I'm going to have to continue it at some point later. So yes, I want to do a Jellicoe series, but I don't want to add yet another unfinished mini-series to the channel just yet. So I want to try and focus this year, as well as obviously doing the Patreon voted videos, general videos, which I've had on my list to do for a while, but I also want to focus on closing out at least some of the ongoing mini-series this year, which will then, I think, give me a bit more license to go forward and start new mini-series. And in terms of the board of the Admiralty, at least for the period that you're looking at, in the run-up to World War I, it's a relatively large organisation, but I'll just cover some of the higher-ranking members of it. So you have the First Lord of the Admiralty, who by this point is a civilian and a member of the cabinet. So at this point in history, the Royal Navy doesn't have a Ministry of Defence. The Admiralty and the various incarnations of whatever it is that's heading up the army at that point are actually 2 completely separate organisations with separate representatives to the cabinet. So Nowadays, we have the Secretary of Defense. So the First Lord of the Admiralty is essentially kind of like the Secretary of Defense, but for the Navy only. So in the US, obviously, you have the Secretary of the Navy, but you also have a Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War. These days, I think it is. Anyway, who sits above them. Whereas at this time period in Britain, you have the First Lord of the Admiralty is kind of the ultimate authority when it comes to the Navy. He doesn't report to anyone above him in the hierarchy in the cabinet. There isn't a defence minister. There's just the First Lord of the Admiralty and his opposite number for the Army, because of course the Air Force at this point doesn't exist. And then you have a series of Sea Lords, 1st through 5th, and these are naval officers. I suppose the First Lord of the Admiralty is a civilian. The Sea Lords are serving naval officers. The First Sea Lord is the head of the Navy and essentially directs grand strategy. The Second Sea Lord is responsible for the men, so manning ships, mobilizing people in World War I context, mobilizing the Third Fleet, basically getting the crew to the ships that are necessary, etc. The Third Sea Lord is essentially the head of the Royal Navy's design and construction department, making sure the ships get manufactured and what specs they're manufactured to. Also covers weapons development and so forth. The Fourth Sea Lord is responsible for moving men, supplies, food, medicine, etc., to the places that it needs to go. And the Fifth Sea Lord is a relatively new addition at that point, but he's in charge of naval aviation. There's also a financial secretary and someone called the Civil Lord of the Admiralty. The financial secretary, unsurprisingly, is dealing with the finances of everything. The Civil Lord is working with the civilian side of the Navy, i.e. not the commissioned naval officers, not the ratings, etc. The civilians who obviously are usually working ashore, perhaps developing weapons, supporting the naval bases, etc., working in the dockyards, that kind of stuff, and the actual land-based property that the Navy has. And then there's a whole ton of other people, but those are the main people at kind of the head of the table of the Admiralty Board. Eric Van Dooting asks, could ships with torpedo tubes on both sides of their hull fire their torpedoes on the side away from the enemy without turning to unmask them, at least to a degree, by setting the gyros to have the torpedoes turn toward the target after initially being launched in the wrong direction? Theoretically, yes, you could do this. In practice, you generally would not. And that's simply for, well, two primary reasons. Firstly, if you fire the torpedoes either in the direct opposite direction or perhaps as close to in the relevant direction as you can, given how your torpedo tubes might be able to bear, the torpedo obviously has to go out in one direction. You then and you'd have to program the gyro for it to loop back and then come past you, either fore or aft, and head off after the enemy. That travel distance is going to be quite extensive, and therefore there's going to be a fair amount of time that torpedo is travelling. And then it's now at just simply the point where a torpedo fired on the engaged side would be starting from. So your fire control solution is going to be immensely more complicated because you've got to work out not only what track can I do that is going to allow that torpedo to loop back around and not blow my own bow or stern off or hit a ship potentially that might be ahead or behind me in the line, but also I've got my, relatively speaking, straight shot at the target from the minute it crosses my bow or stern, but I've got to work out how long it's going to take it to get there, and therefore how much further ahead the enemy ship is going to be. And of course, in all that time, the enemy ship has much more opportunity to maneuver and just do things even if it doesn't realize it's being shot at by torpedoes that might throw off the entire solution. So it's an incredibly complicated thing to set up, although you could theoretically set it up, which is relatively unlikely to actually hit anything simply because of the time involved. And also, of course, while it's doing that 180-degree back, it's burning fuel, so its range is reduced compared to a torpedo that you're just firing straight at the enemy. The second issue is simply that torpedo gyros are great in theory. However, even in World War II, torpedo gyros that were set to do anything particularly strenuous tended to have a nasty habit of every so often just going, okay, we're just going round and round and round and round and round and basically doing a big circle. And what was at the end of that big circle? You. So, setting a torpedo gyro to maybe course correct 5-10 degrees, fine. If you asked it to do 45 degrees, 90 degrees, or in this case, approaching 180 degrees potentially, there was an exponentially higher chance that torpedo would just keep going around and come back and blow you up instead. So people tended to just try and avoid that kind of setting on torpedoes as a matter of principle. Ian Carr asks, when discussing the fate of HMS Valiant in her dry dock, you stated she was in better condition than her similarly modernised sister Queen Elizabeth. Could you please expand on this? Yep, and there's two main reasons why I said that. So, first of all, there's the fact that when the Italians managed to damage both Queen Elizabeth and Valiant in Alexandria Harbour, they did considerably more damage to Queen Elizabeth through, two primary means. Firstly, they had two sets of mines that went after Queen Elizabeth, as opposed to just one that went after Valiant. And it appears that while the Italian frogmen who went after Queen Elizabeth were able to successfully attach their mines directly to Queen Elizabeth's hull, and therefore obviously did considerable damage, with Valiant, they either didn't manage to attach the mine or it detached at some point thereafter and fell off. Whatever happened, it wasn't attached to Valiant's hull when it exploded, and therefore it was only the one explosion, and it was individually somewhat less damaging than either of the explosions aboard Queen Elizabeth. So, and that's reflected in the fact that Valiant took months to repair, Queen Elizabeth took a year and a half to repair. So we're also obviously talking about wartime repairs, so not everything is going to be absolutely as it was when she came out of the dry dock after her modernisation. There is a certain amount of making good. Obviously, they would do the best they could to restore her to full operational service, but there are always going to be some corners cut in wartime repairs. That's just the nature of the beast. But then on top of that, when Queen Elizabeth finally recommissions, she, by the time that this happens to Valiant in summer 1944, Queen Elizabeth has been in service in various places, the Home Fleet and then obviously the Eastern Fleet, for about a year. So she's had about a year of wear and tear happening to her, whereas Valiant, although she recommissions considerably earlier and therefore has been active in the Mediterranean and all sorts of other places, she actually goes in for a couple of months of refit between October and the start of December 1943. So when she heads out to the Eastern Fleet at the end of 1943, she's essentially been reset as much as a wartime refit can be. So she's going into her deployment to the Eastern Fleet both with a much smaller history of damage compared to Queen Elizabeth, and she's also had a refreshing refit relatively recently. So by the time of the dry dock collapse, she's only got about half as many at-sea miles on her as Queen Elizabeth has from the last time she left from a refit. And therefore, overall, that's why I say Valiant would have been in slightly better condition than Queen Elizabeth at the time the dry dock collapsed on her. Paul Frederick asks, Drac, if you're the chief engineer of USS New York in 1918 while attached to the Grand Fleet, the ship and several others are out on a training exercise steaming at an efficient speed. You have 14 boilers, but for efficiency, would all of them have been fully pressurized? The bridge then rings down for full speed ahead. Perhaps there's some U-boat been spotted or another threat. What do you have to do, and how long will it take a coal-fired ship to get up to full speed? After all, it's not like just turning up the oil pump sprayers. So, because this is wartime, you would have all 14 boilers lit, and they wouldn't necessarily be up to absolute full working pressure, but you would be keeping all 14 boilers at least a nominal working pressure. Obviously, you'd have some that would be going at absolute full steam to keep you moving at your efficient cruising speed, and you might even be alternating between boilers depending on which boilers are feeding the engines, specifically to allow you to keep a bit more pressure in the boilers generally, rather than just running constantly on a few while keeping others at nominal pressure. So when the bridge rings down for full speed, then obviously the first thing you do is stoke the fires, get all the boilers starting to approach their full pressure, and then you would have to look at exactly how much pressure each boiler is generating and release the most pressure that you safely and reasonably could to the engines from each of them. So obviously at that point you'd have some boilers that were already operating full pelt. That's fine, they keep doing what they're doing. But for the other boilers, you have to play a very careful game, because you have steam pressure there, you want to use it, you want to accelerate immediately, but if you just open the valves completely and dump all that steam into the engine, sure, you'll get a very brief power boost, but you'll have massively dropped the pressure in those boilers, the ones that you're trying to bring up to full steam, and that in turn will make it much more difficult for you to regain that pressure. So what you need to do is essentially play a very careful balancing act where you're releasing a bunch of steam to your engines to get you moving more quickly, but not so much that you're dropping the pressure too much. And then obviously as the fires are stoked and the boiler gets hotter, the pressure increases. Not only will you be able to maintain that flow of steam, but as the steam pressure in the boiler comes up, you can start to release more and more and more steam through to the engines, and that will obviously bring you up to speed gradually. Now, that would be your generic way of doing it. If you were knowing that you were going into a particularly dangerous situation, you might well just have all the boilers up at near enough full steam. So, but even then, releasing steam to the engines to get up to a full speed situation would still be a regulated way of doing things, because of course again you don't want to just dump steam in at full pressure and lose the pressure in the individual boilers. As for how long that's going to take, it's going to vary quite considerably depending on exactly what pressure the boilers are at the time, how quickly the fires can be stoked, and how well your stokers are doing, because obviously you just shovel a ton of coal in, you could end up damping the fires before it catches. And also what other demands are being made of the ship, particularly what other demands are being made of the ship that might require steam pressure elsewhere. But all things considered, assuming that you've got a decent reserve of steam pressure at the time the call comes through, you could get up to close to full speed relatively quickly within the span of, say, less than 15 minutes. But getting from that, let's say, 90% of full speed up to final full speed, as with, well, doing that in any circumstance really, is going to take considerably longer, because if you look at the power curves for these ships, that last 10% takes almost as long as the previous 90. And finally, for this half of things, Slow Pixie asks, "Hi Drac, a little clarification about my question in Drydock 387. I understand completely your explanation about short guns versus long guns and the trade-off therein, but could you be a bit more specific? I know that cannon performance in the Age of Sail is not as easily accessible as, say, World War II with tables, etc., but roughly speaking, how much of a drop-off in penetration would you expect from short 36s and 24s compared to their long gun counterparts? Do you think they could still punch through a third-rate's hull at, say, 1,000 yards or beyond? As the Swedes noted, they were still plenty accurate at that distance, with, say, 2 out of 3 shots hitting a frigate-sized target. Or would a more standard long 32 and 18-pounder setup overshadow them already at that range? Well, unfortunately, when it comes to gunpowder smoothbore cannon, you can't be very, very specific because of things like the windage and the production values of any given cannon and any given shot. However, there were a series of experiments, and for this question, I actually went and dug up a series of gunnery experiments that were published in 1805, which cover both the length of a gun barrel and the other important thing, which is that with shorter gun barrels, generally speaking, smaller charges are used. Now, exactly what the difference would be between using short 36s and 24s in the case that you asked about in Drydock 387 versus long 32s and 18s, I can't give you the exact difference, but I can give you some idea of differences. So it notes in those experiments that if you shorten the barrel, it seems that with heavy guns of the time, there would be a reduction in force, velocity, etc., of about 1/6 for either halving the length or an increase of 1/6 for doubling the length from a standard barrel of 8 or 9 feet long. And then in separate experiments using, in that particular case, a 24-pounder, they established that doubling the weight of a charge from, in that case, 8 pounds to 16 seems to have about a 20% variance on range. But obviously these are for identical guns, and in the example, short 36 versus long 32, they're not the same weights. But if you were comparing like with like, you could expect that if you were firing a shorter barrel gun with, say, half the charge, which wasn't unknown for some of the shorter short barrel guns that were still short barrel cannon as opposed to carronades, you could be looking about a 1/3 decrease in range and obviously commensurate hitting power. Now, what I don't have to hand particularly is direct comparison between 24s, 32s, 36s, and 18s in terms of just generic absolute ranges. But there are a few comparisons between different guns of different sizes, so I would suggest that at 1,000 yards, a short 24, I would expect to perhaps struggle to penetrate the sides of a full-scale ship of the line. Frigate maybe not so much, but certainly a full-sized, third, second, first rate. I think a short 24 would struggle. A short 36 might not, but it would very much depend on the amount of powder that it was shooting compared to a long barrel weapon. And of course you'd have to aim higher to get a similar range with shorter guns with lesser charges anyway. And that's the end of the first half of the Patreon Drydock. A little bit extended in part because a few of the questions had very long answers to them, but well, see you in part 2.